Excuse me.
We must picture to ourselves, the Belgians will say, a monarch mighty in rank and power, effusively cordial to strangers whom he wished to charm and dazzle, but liable to disappoint those who were rash enough to trust in his kindness of heart, always able to give the impression of complete frankness and using this as a means of seduction, really admiring nothing but strength and ready to abuse his own, looking with utter contempt on small states and petty princes, yet never loath to flatter them when occasion demanded. A wooer of public opinion, especially that of other countries, but resolved to defy it in order to attain his ambitions. A ruler who enjoyed a false reputation for chivalry, while he has shown himself relentless in his malice, of a faith that was sincere if superficial, yet did not prevent him from setting his interests above his most solemn engagements and ruthlessly tearing up any treaty that had become inconvenient. Always careful to play his part, and clever in staging his effects, accustomed, unfortunately, to seeing everything bow to his will, such a spoilt child of fortune that he came to the point of thinking himself infallible, one whom Nietzsche might have called a superman and the Romans a demigod. It has been asserted that this demigod was merely an exalted type of the ill-balanced or decadent man. What a mistake! He was in full possession of all his faculties when he ordered that hasty mobilization which made the cataclysm inevitable. Some have maintained that he was, beyond all question, the tool of a caste and a party for whom war was the sole means of consolidating their power. He did indeed listen to their advice, but only because their views were in harmony with his own. Without any hesitation, the verdict of history will make him answerable for the disasters that have overwhelmed Europe. If we carefully read and compare the documents relating to the brief negotiations carried on during the Austro-Serbian crisis, we find ample proof that it was within William II's power, up to the last moment, to say the word that would have prevented war. So far from doing this, he sent his ultimatum to Russia, and thus let loose the deluge at the moment which he had chosen. One would like to believe that he hesitated a long time before venturing upon a path beset with so many terrors. One would fain imagine that his conscience revolted at the thought of the streams of blood and the heart-rending misery which the coming struggle would involve, but that he was swept along, in spite of himself, by an irresistible fate. Idle speculations. The blow had been planned several months in advance. The scheme had been prepared down to its minutest details, and the emperor deliberately hastened on the signal for attack, cutting short in his impatience the discussions which the Entente powers were desperately anxious to continue. The projects that he was carrying out had matured at leisure. Posterity will regard this point as settled, and will brush aside the charge of provocation trumped up against his opponents by himself, by his chancellor, and by his press, in order to gain the suffrages of public opinion at home and abroad. When all is said and done, history will not forgive William of Hohenzollern for having initiated an appalling war carried on in his name. Why these frightful devastations, this systematic destruction of towns, villages, and country houses, this methodical vandalism directed against secular and religious monuments, these wholesale executions of innocent civilians, these unpardonable murders of priests, women, and children, this raping and looting, all this useless cruelty that recalls the native barbarism of the primitive Germanic tribes. For such methods of warfare, posterity, like the present generation, will find no excuse. It will say that the campaign of 1914 in Belgium and in northern France, where these harrowing scenes occurred over and over again, brought dishonor both to the German army and to its emperor.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of like, no.
End of section 2.
He's doomed, so he's trying to bring everybody down with him is what it is. He knows what's about to happen.
Section 3 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Baynes. Translated by Paul V. Cohn.
I'm not stopping.
This Librivox recording is in the public domain.
Go ahead and kick in that door,
read
boys.
by Ted Leinhart. Chapter 2. The Imperial Family, Court, and Government. Part 1. It is generally admitted that the family and personal associates of a sovereign, either by their counsels and
got it,
intrigues
buddy.
or
Me.
merely by the fact
Thanks.
of living together with him and constantly exchanging
appreciate it,
ideas,
fucker. Go ahead and
often
kick in that door and drag
exercising
his ass out the
influence
home.
for good or evil on his political decisions. To this rule, however, there are notable exceptions. Among recent rulers, Leopold II is a case in point. The old Belgian monarch, with his haughty and unsocial spirit, his scorn of advice, and his consciousness of superiority, loved to work out his boldest African designs in the seclusion of his palace, without any help from civil or military officials. But the difference between the founder of the Congo Free State and the German emperor is the difference between a great man and one who is merely talented, and they cannot be said to resemble each other in any particular. Did the family of the Kaiser, the old dignitaries of his court, the chosen companions of his travels and his shooting parties, wield any influence upon his decisions before the war, and can they be made to some extent answerable for its origin? An interesting question, which today we are at liberty to discuss. Women, with the sole exception of the Empress, play no part in the Emperor's life. His marriage was due to reasons of state, having been suggested by Bismarck as an act that would soothe the feelings of the bride's family. It will be remembered that in 1864, with a view to supporting the claims of her father, the Duke of Augustenburg, to the Schleswig-Holstein succession, the Diet of the Germanic Confederation declared war on Christian IX of Denmark. By the final settlement of the Treaty of Prague, Prussia acquired the two duchies for herself. Later on, the Duchess of Augustenburg had the barren honor of seeing her daughter invited to share the Hohenzollern throne. This political match has proved a well-assorted one in the middle-class sense of the term. Its happiness seems to have been assured by the usual law of contrasts, by temperamental differences, the one partner being entirely lacking in reserve, passionately fond of noise and publicity, the other quiet, modest, and well-balanced.
Oh, they're overriding the system?
Neither in her physical nor in her mental attributes does the Empress bear any resemblance to the celebrated Louisa, the wife of Frederick William III of Prussia, that vain and commonplace ruler of whom Napoleon, always contemptuous of the Hohenzollerns, said that he looked like a tailor in the midst of kings. The two queens are alike only in the large number of princes with whom they have enriched a stock that is nowhere near extinction. Madame de Stael, while staying in Berlin, described Queen Louisa in a letter to her father as the most beautiful woman of her court. Yet some years later, this beauty, more appealing than ever through the unkind strokes of fate, was unable to soften the marble heart of the victor of Jena. No figure is more popular in modern Germany, more glorified by her admirers, historians and poets, painters and sculptors. Will the same fortune befall the Empress Augusta Victoria? We may be pardoned for doubting this. At the utmost, she will attract only the official brush or chisel. But should dark days come for the imperial house, should Germanic Caesarism, after a premature blaze of glory, suffer a twilight of the gods and a stormy downfall, the Empress, with her steadfast devotion, will, no doubt, like Queen Louisa, find words of comfort for her disconsolate husband. She will help him to endure the misfortunes that he will have deserved only too well. It is in the vast white ballroom of the palace, when a court ball is being given, that the august lady, as the Berlin newspapers reverently call her, shows up to the best advantage. The function is drawing to a close. The couples, officers of the guards, and high-born damsels, who have been performing the intricate old-world dances with military precision, assemble for a last figure before dispersing merrily into the supper rooms.
Gotcha.
At the sound of the royal march, they bow several times respectfully, each time drawing closer together in their semicircular rows in front of the platform on which stands the solitary figure of the Empress. She gives no little impression of majesty as she receives the homage and thanks of her youthful guests, still erect in bearing and well proportioned, with her white hair set off by a diamond tiara, a rope of priceless pearls around her neck, the yellow ribbon of the black eagle athwart her bosom, and a kindly smile playing on her lips. At the same time, she is an excellent mother and a good German housewife, carefully looking after her husband's health, and more absorbed in her children than in her subjects. As mistress of the house, she has a great deal to do. Her task it is to allay the petty storms that arise at court, to reconcile the crown prince with his father after each fresh escapade of that unruly heir, or to secure the emperor's consent to the morganatic marriage of another son, who has fallen madly in love with a mere maid of honor. Every December it is her chief delight to prepare the Christmas tree in the Muschelsaal, the grotto in the Rococo Palace at Potsdam. Her great aim is to make the family life in the royal residences as cozy and homely, gemütlich, as that of a humble Prussian squire. Like other royalties, she looks upon works of patronage and Christian benevolence as a formal duty, and this duty she carries out to the full. She even presides at charity bazaars, where her presence adds a spur to the generosity of the more laggard purchasers. But it is no use to expect from her any of those charming acts of impulse or of delicate sympathy that distinguish such a sovereign as the Queen of the Belgians, when some misfortune or some talent has attracted her notice. The Empress's artistic tastes are faithfully modeled on those of her husband. She sees only through his eyes, and cannot sincerely admire anything unless he deigns to signify his approval. The distinctive feature of her character is a rigid, uncompromising Protestantism, which will not tolerate the presence of any Catholic, either among her ladies-in-waiting or among the household servants of the palace. As a staunch defender of a creed that is steadily losing ground even in the country of Luther, she has set herself to stem the rising tide of atheism, to combat the free thought that wraps itself like a winding sheet about the expiring faith of the great cities. The uprooting of the religious sense is partly due to social democracy, which pursues the work with great success among the laboring classes, while at the same time it undermines monarchical institutions. The Empress endeavors to beat back this relentless foe of the old German beliefs by building a large number of churches. One sees them rising in the principal squares of the new quarters of Berlin, red brick temples of a vague or distorted Gothic, hopelessly void of architectural distinction. In no single instance does the architect succeed in giving a faithful reproduction of the beautiful Christian models. The finest modern church in Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, this edifice, for once in a way, is built entirely of stone, is nothing but a rather unwieldy mixture of Roman and Byzantine. Nor can it be said that, with all this wealth of new sanctuaries, religion has gained what art has lost. In the manufacturing towns, to the great grief of the Empress, the march of atheism and of indifference in matters of faith keeps pace with that of socialism. It would be a mistake to suppose that this admirable wife and mother, this incarnation of Protestant Germany on the imperial throne, is in any way a pacifist. When the emperor, after 25 years of his reign had passed, abruptly left the straight and tranquil path that he had marked out for the happiness of his subjects, his consort, we may be quite sure, made no effort to hold him back. In spite of her placid femininity, German patriotism, with its dreams of domination, continually haunts her brain. The horrors of war, that bane to mothers, bella matribus detestata, do not dismay the wife of William II. During the crisis of Agadir, when the court of Berlin was chafing with impatience to measure its strength with France on another field than that of diplomacy, the Empress shared the impulse which she felt throbbing in the air around her. In a tone of reproach, she said to Herr von Kitterlen-Vector, whom she disliked, "Are we always going to retreat before the French and put up with their insolence?" Segment 2. For some years past, the Crown Prince has been talked about a great deal, a fact which has certainly not been displeasing to him. He has been credited with a decisive influence in the course of events at the moment when the threatenings of war became critical. It was alleged that this young man of 32, acting behind the scenes, was the real deus ex machina of the whole drama, that he, the idol of the army, had imposed his will and that of the officers' corps on his father, while the latter's mind was not yet made up. The Crown Prince deserves nor such wild honor nor such brand of shame. In physique he is an officer of light infantry. Slender of waist and narrow of chest, he cuts a smart figure, especially on horseback. He does not in any way resemble the usual Hohenzollern type with its broad shoulders and regular features. His face is extremely youthful, with a certain vagueness in its outlines. His forehead recedes. His eyes show no sign of a lively intelligence, and his body has a look of suppleness rather than of strength and fitness for war. Appearances in this case are deceptive. The prince is a tough soldier and an ardent sportsman. Polo, tennis, football, hockey, golf, yachting. There is no sport that he does not practice. Before the war, he liked to imitate the English and posed as a German Anglomaniac. His father had to forbid him to ride in steeplechases because an heir apparent must on no account run the risk of a dangerous fall,
He thinks it's a joke.
but was
It is
unable
not.
to prevent him from going in for aviation. Of all William II's sons, the Crown Prince seems to be the most soldierly, but this does not mean that he will ever make a capable army leader. At a first glance, he does not seem to bear any resemblance to the emperor, but after a time, one finds out several parallel traits in their characters. Less well-informed, less cultured, less versatile, but just as self-willed, the son has inherited his father's impetuous spirit and incurable propensity for freely uttering his thoughts. A line of impulsive rulers is what the modern Hohenzollerns, very different from their ancestors, have given to Germany. The Crown Prince has the soul of a fighter, or at any rate he prides himself on that quality. At an official dinner, where he sat next to the wife of an ambassador from one of the Entente powers, he could not think of anything more clever and gallant to say than that it was his cherished dream to make war and to lead a charge at the head of his regiment. His militarism, however, does not prevent him from venturing into certain intellectual and even literary fields. A diary of his hunting tour in India, published in his name, has given us a detailed account of his feats as a Nimrod. Less commonplace and more personal is a brief passage, eagerly reproduced in the German press, in which, on leaving Danzig, he bade farewell to his regiment of Death's Head Hussars. His spirit reveals itself here in a certain vein of martial poetry. If any German pacifists, of whom there is a very large number, whatever the world may think, read this rhapsody in honor of Bologna, they must have felt considerable misgivings. The relations between the emperor and his son ceased to be very cordial from the day when the young prince, brimming over with ambition and desire for popularity, tried to get himself talked about by dabbling in politics. His first open interference in state affairs is worth recalling, because it is a striking testimony to his feelings with regard to France.
Magic?
It took place in 1911 at that meeting of the Reichstag where Herr von Heidebrand, the spokesman of the Prussian Junkers, delivered a trenchant criticism of German policy in Morocco, of the Treaty of 4th November, and of the way in which the Chancellor had defended the interests of the Empire. During this philippic, the Crown Prince, sitting by himself in the imperial box, made repeated signs of approval. Since then, he has become the hope of the reactionary party and of the military caste. Encouraged by this success, he has never omitted, on any important occasion, to express his ideas or to convey them by some mouthpiece, even when these ideas were in conflict with those of his father, as represented by the Chancellor. It would be superfluous to quote these various demonstrations. A congratulatory telegram to the hero of the Zabern affair finally won for the prince the hearts of those who in Prussia wear the king's garb, in other words, the officers of the army. If only he had always remained on the neutral ground that lies between politics and the army.
Paperwork.
His want of tact and good feeling in this respect is shown by the way in which he tried to balk the efforts of the imperial government in the settlement of the Brunswick succession. The oath of loyalty to the emperor tendered by Duke Ernest of Cumberland, heir to the duchy and son-in-law to his majesty, on entering the army, did not seem to the Crown Prince, or for the matter of that to a good many typical Prussians, sufficient reason for admitting his brother-in-law to the last Guelph inheritance, to which he was the legitimate successor. The Crown Prince held that Duke Ernest should further be required to make a formal renunciation of his claims to the Hanoverian throne. The emperor proved more shrewd and more politic, and the young ducal couple was enabled to enter Brunswick amid general acclamation. A section of the German press, disgusted at the crown prince's perpetual meddling with affairs that did not concern him, dryly reminded him that he had no special status under the Prussian or imperial constitution, and that he could only claim the right, enjoyed by every citizen, of stating his opinion as a mere private individual. This endless hunting after personal popularity led to family scenes which the palace walls in Berlin and Potsdam, impenetrable though they are as a rule, could not altogether keep secret from an inquisitive public. The banishment of the crown prince to Danzig was solely due to his intemperate language in speech and writing. The emperor sent him, for his sins, to a remote corner of Prussia under the pretext of making him learn his duties as a regimental commander. After a time it became evident that in his distant fortress he was more embarrassing and less easy to watch than in Berlin. He was therefore recalled and put upon the general staff, nominally that he might be initiated into the mysteries of Prussian strategy and tactics, really that he might remain under his father's eye. In point of fact, we must not make too much of his escapades, which are traditional among heirs to the Hohenzollern throne. Frederick the Great, famous before his accession for his quarrels with his brutal sire, was not the first Prussian heir apparent who rebelled against paternal authority. Later on, in the last century, the Emperor William I, when he was next in the line of succession to his brother Frederick William IV, held, during the latter's reign, a little princely court that was a hotbed of criticism and opposition, and the present emperor, who will believe that in his passionate self-assertiveness he would not have caused just as much vexation and embarrassment to his father if the Emperor Frederick had reigned for more than a few months. We should misjudge William II if we attributed to him any jealousy of his son's growing popularity. He has too exalted an idea of his own worth for that, and he cannot cherish any illusions as to the real capacity of his heir. To insinuate that the emperor took time by the forelock owing to his fear of this popularity, which threatened to eclipse his own, would be tantamount to saying that the crown prince was the causa causans, the prime mover of the appeal to arms, and this would be assigning to him an importance and an influence which he has never at any time possessed. His incitements to war and his martial ardor would never have succeeded in making any impression on the emperor if the latter had not himself resolved to forge ahead and to risk the great gamble in which the fate of Germany and of Europe was at stake. The German Empire, as Bismarck conceived it, with a single minister bearing on his own shoulders, like some atlas, the whole weight of the vast governmental machine, was cut to the measure of its founder. If this system is to last, the nation must always have at its head either a great chancellor or a great monarch under whom the chancellor merely acts as his deputy. So long as Bismarck was at the helm, he steered the ship of empire with an unfaltering hand through all the reefs of internal politics, Kulturkampf, anti-socialist legislation, party divisions, unstable majorities in the Reichstag.
Keep doing it.
After the dismissal of the great man, and under the powerful impetus that he had given her, the vessel kept on her course for some time, having for her pilot the sovereign himself, who made up for his lack of genius by his ample self-confidence. In this way she safely passed many rocks, borne along by the swelling tide of national prosperity, but occasionally threatened with disaster for want of a submissive majority to vote credits in the imperial parliament. It is not difficult to imagine what would become of the empire under the crown prince's rule. He too, like his father, but with less intelligence, will wish to be at the helm, and by the sheer force of his will as monarch by divine right, to stem the rising tide of popular demands, growing ever hungrier and stormier under the sweeping blast of socialism. The conception of liberty that Treitschke shadowed forth for his countrymen about 1870, a liberty having its roots in the idea of duty, that is to say, where politics are concerned, in obedience to the powers that be, will not prevail in the Germany of the future. In my opinion, it is not even accepted by the majority of Germans today. Their conception is that of a liberty based on the idea of justice rather than of duty. In other words, on the nation's right to share, through its representatives, in the government of the empire. Thus, there is a prospect of bitter struggles between a ruler of the crown prince's type and a Reichstag that is half or three-fourths socialist, assuming indeed that these struggles do not begin long before he comes to the throne. Segment 3. The 5 remaining sons of the emperor give little food for public discussion. Like happy nations, they have no history. Political ambitions and the chase for popularity they leave to their eldest brother. Their lives are passed in a pleasant round of military service, less arduous for princes than for ordinary officers, social amusements, and sport. Only one of them has entered the Navy, where work is certainly harder than in the Army. 3 others, as officers of the Guards, used to do garrison duty at Potsdam, spending the season of festivities in Berlin. One, on leaving the University of Strasbourg, was sent off to a provincial station. From time to time, in winter, one or more of the young princely couples were to be seen in diplomatic drawing rooms. It must not be imagined, however, that they were anxious to consort with ambassadors and foreign ministers.
Okay, dude.
They have no particular respect for those who represent the countries of the Old World or the New, and in general, like Alfred de Musset's hero, they profess a high disdain for peoples and for...
Again, I'm not waiting on you to do this here. It's like, the more I wait, the worse off it's going to be for you. Come on. Everybody trying to leave their mark. I promise you I'm going to shit on you, motherfucker. Let's go. Hurry up. Let's go. There we go. I promise you it better be a different fucking group. We walked out for a reason. Moving forward. Come on, I've approached you now. We've approached you. Thank you.
Kings. Their horizon is bounded by Germany.
No.
Nay, it is even restricted to the frontiers of Prussia. The idea of gaining enlightenment from good sources as to the political institutions, the internal situation, or the state of public opinion in other countries leaves them entirely cold, just as it fails to attract the crown prince. As a rule, a quick handshake without words was all that they accorded to the heads of foreign legations. But as soon as one of our confraternity got together a small band of musicians for a ball or an informal dance, the princes were glad to do him the honor of letting themselves be invited. The diplomatic drawing rooms were in their eyes nothing but rendezvous for dancing and flirtation. Their stiffness showed itself most plainly of all in their relations with the other German princes. Anyone who watched them at official functions, weddings, funerals, the unveiling of monuments, or the laying of foundation stones, when members of the royal or princely families of the empire were present, must have been struck with their attitude. They did not mix with the others, but formed a group apart, as if to impress the public with the fact that they were the dominant race, and the rest mere vassals or creatures of the herd. This lofty opinion that they had of themselves and of the greatness of their house did not indeed prevent them from sometimes behaving quite humanly towards the scions of certain families that enjoyed the inestimable privilege of being connected by blood with the Hohenzollerns. The foreigner who is interested in the future of Germany is naturally inclined to raise the question, is it an advantage or merely a burden for the Prussian state to possess so large a royal family? He need only ask any honest German who is not afraid to say what he thinks, whether princes who live a life apart, cut off from modern ideas and interests, and antagonistic to every liberal tendency, are a blessing or a curse to their dynasty and their country. There can be little doubt as to the answer he will receive. A more interesting personality is that of Prince Henry, the Emperor's brother. One can say of this capable second fiddle to the Kaiser that he is a model of fraternal devotion. In appearance, he exhibits a striking contrast with his brother, and in mental qualities, the difference between them is still more marked. Taller, slimmer, and stronger, with a complexion tanned by the Baltic breezes, he is simple and frank in intercourse. He has a natural affability and shows no trace of haughtiness or affectation. He never stayed long at court. Hardly had he been announced there before he was off again to resume at Kiel his duties as Grand Admiral and Inspector General of the fleet, since the sedentary life of the capital has no charm for his active spirit. Sailor, diplomat, and sportsman, these are the three phases in which he has appeared before the world.
Yeah,
As squadron commander, he devoted himself chiefly to training the infant German Navy, to making the high sea fleet of dreadnoughts, torpedo boats, and submarines a formidable arm in the power of its ships, the efficiency of its officers, and the discipline of its crews. His connection with the royal family of Great Britain afforded him a pretext for frequent visits to the neighbor island. There he learnt something of the strong and the weak points of that British Navy which he was preparing to fight one day. He liked to call himself the comrade and admirer of English sailors, until he had a chance of torpedoing their vessels and of attempting to destroy their maritime supremacy.
Yeah, that's kind of what it is.
And sending Prince Henry on a special mission
really
to the United States under delicate circumstances, a coolness had arisen between the two countries, owing to an incident in the Philippines during the Hispano-American War.
Yes, I am that angry.
William II entrusted him with the task of inaugurating his American policy of conciliation and friendship.
I got my own button.
No other Prussian royalty would have been so skillful as Prince Henry in winning the sympathies of the journalists of New York and Chicago by his democratic simplicity and frankness of manner. He acquitted himself with equal success in his difficult missions to Russia and Japan. Quite recently, the Emperor sent him to the South American republics, this time to prepare the way for flooding the markets of Brazil, Argentina, and Chile with the innumerable products of German industry. The prince has also become a zealous propagandist of the sports which aim at training the German youth for war. A motorist from the earliest days of motoring, he has applied himself to spreading the use of this rapid means of transport. His alert brain was one of the first to grasp the military value of aviation. While he has had no obvious place among the emperor's advisors, all his efforts have been directed towards equipping the nation for a struggle which he himself regarded as imminent. In this way, he has borne his share in making it inevitable. Segment 4. When a ruler, like some conspicuous star, rivets the attention of the civilized world, his satellites, careful not to shed any light that may dim the radiance of their lord, are content to remain in modest obscurity. This principle holds good at the court of Berlin. The high executive posts are filled by competent men of suave manners. None of them enjoys any special prominence, although they all are or have been members of the army and belong to the landed gentry. They have always espoused the doctrines of the Prussian military caste and conservative party, and share the hatred of these reactionaries for France and for the powers that have thrown in their lot with the Republic. In their conversation with their master, it was inevitable that delenda est Gallia should be the perpetual refrain. This harmony of feeling among those around him would have impressed the mind of William II, even if he had not been so ready to assimilate their views. The court functionary who, before the war, was said to possess most credit with the Kaiser was the mistress of the Empress's household, a stern guardian of Prussian etiquette and tradition. There is no likelihood that she used her power to counteract the baneful influence of her fellow courtiers of the other sex. The same truth applies to a high-born aristocrat of Austrian origin, Prince Max Egon von Fürstenberg, who today, in the Emperor's circle of friends, holds the place formerly occupied by the fascinating but depraved Philip von Eulenburg. He is the obvious favorite, the Kaiser's indispensable confidant, addressed by his master with a thou of intimacy. He was given one of the great ornamental court posts, that of Grand Marshal, as a prelude, it was whispered, to a far more important position in the government. But how could this newcomer, half German and half Austrian, who migrated to Berlin after inheriting vast estates from Karl Egon, his cousin of the elder branch, ever have undertaken anything but a sinecure, since he was unable to manage his own property? Instead of quietly enjoying the princely income derived from his patrimony, Prince Egon took it into his head that he had a genius for business, like Herr von Gwinner, the director of the Deutsche Bank, or Herr Boleyn,
Because I'm not
the
in a
king of
simulator,
Germany's
you know what I mean?
mercantile marine. With another money
all.
grandee of equal inexperience, Prince von Hohenlohe-Oringen, he founded the famous Prince's Trust, a unique example, I believe, of an aristocratic ring boldly competing with the lords of finance, industry, and commerce. In a few years, this trust piled one enterprise upon another, beginning with magnificent hotels in Berlin and Hamburg. The crash was not long in coming. Today, Prince von Hohenlohe is ruined, and his associate has been compelled to mortgage his ancestral estates to the tune of over £1 million. Like many of his peers, laughter being an attribute of kings as of other mortals, William II requires to be amused. Prince Egon is a sparkling companion with a happy knack in telling good stories. He has all the untiring fluency of the Viennese. This obviously is enough to explain his success. In certain circles, however, people persist in crediting him with a mysterious sway over his imperial master, and in regarding him as the power behind the throne who whispers advice into the sovereign's ear. That he may have served now and then as a link between Vienna and Berlin, between the Archduke Ferdinand and William II, is not unlikely. At the close of the Balkan War, the Kaiser seemed to have abandoned his ally during the latter's vain efforts to secure the revision of the Treaty of Bucharest. Fürstenberg may have been used immediately afterwards to set the connection upon its former footing of intimacy and confidence. Before the murder of the Archduke, he may have acted as a go-between for the two cronies when they drew up the plan of a war of revenge which, while compensating Austria for her disappointments, was to set up the supremacy of Germany in continental Europe. To assign Prince Egon a more important role would be overrating his mental capacity. We may safely acquit him of any share in the direct responsibility for the war.
The answer is no. You are not jumping ahead on that.
By the terms of the 1871 Constitution, the Empire is a congerie of federated states.
Thank you. You are not.
The Emperor, at the head of the other reigning princes, should properly be nothing but the primus inter pares, the first among his peers, invested with very wide prerogatives and powers. At a banquet given by the German Chamber of Commerce on the occasion of Tsar Nicholas's coronation, the present King of Bavaria, Prince Ludwig, as he then was, made a vigorous attack upon a speaker who had alluded to the royalties attending this function as being in the retinue of Prince Henry of Prussia, representing his august brother. In emphatic terms, Prince Ludwig reminded his hearers that the German princes were not the vassals, but the federal partners of the emperor. The incident has not yet been forgotten in Berlin, and this spirited protest won great popularity for its author in South Germany. But was he justified in what he said? In sober truth, the King of Bavaria, who under a homely exterior hides a most keen and subtle mind, the King of Saxony, with his loud voice, sonorous laugh, and martial gait, the King of Württemberg, that model of a polished gentleman, the amiable Grand Duke of Baden, and the other lesser gods of the modern German Valhalla, all these rulers are the very humble servants of the Kaiser. In vain do they assume a tone of equality when exchanging with him telegrams in which the affectionate "thou" is part of the official style. In vain do they flit like busy bees about their dominions, make a vast quantity of speeches to their subjects, and honor public ceremonies with their presence. In the eyes of German statesmanship, they are mere instruments of the will of their master who lives in Berlin. Similarly, in the Federal Council, their delegates receive the word of command from the Chancellor and the imperial ministers, and on every important occasion vote submissively with their Prussian colleagues. The shadow of the Emperor lies over all Germany. The work of unification proceeds, gradually draining the lifeblood from the moribund body of separatism, while the Reichstag, by its encroachments on the powers and privileges of the local diets, strives to become the sole deliberative assembly that can boast any real authority. Must we infer from this that the reigning houses are useless, and that the first emperor would have done well to suppress them if such had been his will and pleasure after the victories of 1870? I do not think so. When Bismarck, setting his face against the plea for centralization put forward by the Prussian heir apparent, succeeded in inducing old King William to adopt his plan of a federal empire such as exists today. He did not foresee, perhaps, that these potentates, although retaining but a shadow of their sovereignty, would be the solid pillars of the monarchical principle in the new Germany. If they had been entirely dispossessed, the socialist and republican propaganda would have made giant strides wherever the Prussian regime was detested. The peoples of the different states, having been governed in paternal fashion for some centuries by these local dynasties, have for the most part maintained their loyalty to the ruling houses. The Hohenzollerns, in their capacity as emperors, have not yet struck their roots deep into the country. They are loved only as kings of Prussia in their ancestral provinces to the east of the Elbe. It is difficult to believe that the news of the declaration of war was received with delight by all these pseudo-sovereigns who had not been consulted as to its necessity. For form's sake, the rulers of Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, and Baden were apprised throughout of the hurried march of events. For some, the war interfered with old, comfortable habits. So long as it lasted, there was no possibility of travels abroad, of visits to watering places, or even of hunting parties. Almost all were faced with the prospect of family losses. Yet each of them, from discipline or from a thrill of genuine patriotism, thought it his duty to hail the news with enthusiasm. The kings of Bavaria and Saxony delivered speeches no less warlike than those of the emperor. All hastened to swim with the stream. It is worthwhile pointing out, indeed, since some have wrongly held the contrary view, that the war was greeted with no less acclamation in the rest of Germany than in Prussia itself. The earliest demonstrations in Munich were as noisy as those in Berlin. In Dresden, the mob, with at least as much frenzy as the good folk of the Prussian capital, broke the windows of the British legation. This state of feeling shows, in the first place, that in southern Germany, with its placid inhabitants, a section of public opinion, the section that made itself so prominent, had been quite as much perverted, quite as deeply tainted with the pan-Germanic virus as the corresponding class in northern Germany, who had long been infatuated with the notion of their own military superiority. And in the second place, that German unity is now considered by all Germans to be an essential condition of their national existence. It was Bismarck who, in order to win popular approval for that German unity which he had forged, conceived the masterly idea of tempering it in a war with a foreign enemy. An attempt to break the chain would, in my opinion, be unwise. The links, if snapped asunder for the moment by an external force, would become welded again of their own accord. In a conquered Germany, however, the federal rulers, who yesterday bowed down low before the emperor, would tomorrow perhaps be the first to raise their heads and to deny their humbled Caesar that preeminence which he had used so ill. End of section 3.
Yeah, it's like, okay, I'm moving on. Now, here's George. I'm moving on. I need the money for the business that is at hand here.
Section 4 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Byans, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Leinhardt. Chapter 2, The Imperial Family, Court, and Government, Part 2. Segment 6. The rise of Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg to the position of Chancellor of the Empire has been a triumph for the bureaucracy. And looking for shoulders strong enough to bear the massive heritage of Bismarck, the Emperor, after applying in turn to the army, to the higher aristocracy, and to diplomacy, was bound to fall back upon the Prussian official caste. The fifth Chancellor has passed his whole career in the civil service, beginning as assessor, and advancing through the grades of District President, Prussian Minister of the Interior, and Imperial Secretary of State for Home Affairs, a post that carries with it the duties of Chancellor's deputy. In less than 25 years, he has thus managed to climb every rung of the administrative ladder and to become the greatest man in the state after the Emperor. The fact that he was a fellow student of William II's at Bonn University has presumably done nothing to retard this rapid promotion. Just as in France, every conscript carries a field marshal's baton in his knapsack, so in Prussia, if the example of Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg is anything to go by, Every official at the outset of his career will be able to say that he carries with him his nomination to the post of Chancellor.
Chancellor? Pause you right there. We'll wait. They were excused, so we're going to excuse them. That's all there is to it. We're executing and excusing. Magic does seem pretty solid right now, I'll be honest. I can sit back and I can make a deck. Kind of listen, because I'm listening. I want to listen too. I'm having trouble listening and playing at the same time because I don't know what's going on. I enjoy listening, you know, the history there. Especially being a part of it. It's like, oh, this is amazing. It's hard. I don't want to hear all that. Take it somewhere else. I'm moving forward. Like, your ancestors versus your opinion are two entirely different things. So we can get off the wood knocker there. Now that we've gotten to the bottom of this. Thank you. I'm not interested. Thank you.
What are the striking qualities that determined the emperor's choice and gained for this favored Mandarin the honor of succeeding the brilliant Prince von Bülow? So far as his mind is concerned, when we have praised his honesty, his application to work, his intellectual culture, and his strict religious principles, there is nothing more to say. If we add to this a frank, open face, a gigantic frame, and a genial manner, the portrait will be complete. Friend and foe alike declare that his private life is irreproachable, and all were sincerely sorry for the Chancellor when his wedded bliss was cut short by death. It must be admitted, however, that for a statesman who has to play the leading part among his colleagues in Europe, all the above qualities are of secondary importance. Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg is certainly not without his personal views on politics, although they are far from easy to discover. They might perhaps be defined as follows. For home affairs, a conservatism tempered with doctrinaire leanings, or if you prefer, a conservative system that does not exclude some very moderate liberal tendencies, and as regards foreign policy, an extensive development of German influence, culture, and language in rivalry with the French and the English, who, as he stated in an inspired letter published by the Berlin newspapers, know better than the Germans how to spread their national civilization beyond their own borders. The Chancellor lacks two gifts that would seem to be essential to his functions: a native eloquence and a firm will. He is first and foremost the Emperor's right-hand man, or rather the Emperor's proxy. For the real Chancellor, although the fact is disguised by constitutional fictions, is the sovereign himself. Caprivi, with his independent nature, and Bülow, with his keen desire to maintain his personal prestige, had disappointed William II. From Bethmann-Hollweg, it would seem, there is nothing of the sort to fear. He will always attempt to shield the Emperor's actions with his own constitutional responsibility. He would cheerfully go to the stake and become a burnt offering to public opinion if such a sacrifice were needed for the saving of his master's reputation. In Berlin, he is known as the philosopher of Hohenfinau, this being the name of his estate. A philosopher, if you will, in the equanimity with which he bears the failures of his administration, and with which he will arm himself in his retirement when the hour of disgrace is struck. But above all, a philosopher in his indifference or want of resolution where ethics and politics are concerned. His readiness to bow to the fiats of the imperial will might more properly earn him the name of courtier philosopher. For the matter of that, they are all courtiers in Berlin. All, that is to say, who on any rung of the ladder seek to be honored with the favor or the confidence of the sovereign. In his position with regard to the Reichstag and his influence on that heterogeneous assembly, Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg cannot be compared with his predecessor. He has lived and still lives as a being apart, amid the indifference or hostility of the middle class, otherwise known as monarchical parties. The Liberals expected him to carry out a promised reform of the Prussian electoral law, but finding the measure indefinitely postponed, they view him with suspicion in the Landtag or Prussian Diet, no less than in the Imperial Parliament. The Catholic Center cannot forgive this unbending Protestant for his refusal to restore the right to teach to the Jesuit order. And on the other hand, he is not reactionary enough to please the conservatives. The latter reproached him most bitterly of all 3 years ago for the weakness with which he abandoned his scheme for the financial working of the recent military law and supported the radical counter-scheme put forward by the Reichstag Committee. In fact, at the beginning of 1914, it seemed that Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg's days as a minister were numbered, when suddenly the war came to interrupt all party strife, and the roar of the guns drowned the voice of criticism both in press and in parliament. Officially, the Chancellor is foreign minister for the Empire, but the domain of world politics, as conceived by Prince von Bülow, is so vast that his successor, better versed in the handling of home affairs, would have lost himself in it, had he not let himself be guided by an expert professional diplomat invested with the title of Secretary of State. The first of these guides was Baron von Schoen, followed by Herr von Ketterlen-Vector, and the present Foreign Secretary is Herr von Jägel. On certain occasions, however, the Chancellor was compelled to make a statement on the foreign situation in the Reichstag. He painted his pictures with a broad brush and presented the leading events of the day in a carefully thought-out chiaroscuro well distributed over the canvas. His speeches, which he had learned by heart, seemed tame and colorless, as is no doubt inevitably the case with this type of literary effort. They were entirely lacking in that singular clearness and note of sincerity that marked the kindred utterances of Sir Edward Grey in the House of Commons. Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg is a manner of conciliatory temper, and a large blend of pacifism certainly enters into his nature. The need of a long spell of peace to complete the splendid commercial and industrial expansion of Germany could not have escaped his clear vision. This explains why he was the object of frequent appeals outside the formal discussions from the eminent diplomat who opposed Herr von Ketterlen-Vector in the dangerous game that was being played in connection with Morocco. The French Yellow Book for 1911 contains a report of some conversations that Monsieur Jules Cambon had with the Chancellor, and the impression they gave is that the latter really wished to arrive at a final understanding. It was to the Chancellor again that the ambassador turned when the time came for settling other thorny questions, such as the delimitation of railway concessions and spheres of influence in Asia Minor, and when the German negotiators proved too refractory. In other quarters, a genuine improvement in his country's relations with Great Britain was Bethmann-Hollweg's most cherished dream, without any latent thought, such as would perhaps have occurred to Prince von Bülow, of afterwards giving the death blow at the favorable moment to England's naval supremacy. There is no reason to believe that Herr von Jägel was not speaking the language of sincerity when he expressed to Sir Edward Goschen, in the course of their last painful interview, his poignant regret at the crumbling of his entire policy and that of the Chancellor, which had been to make friends with Great Britain, and through Great Britain to get closer to France. Is this regret compatible with Bethmann-Hollweg's wavering attitude in the Austro-Serbian crisis? I think so. His personal preferences made him lean towards a peaceful solution, but this weak man let his hand be forced by the war party and bowed as usual to the will of the Emperor. He was all the more ready to take this course,
I'm not
and that he
excited
was
like
nothing
you
but
are,
a tool,
bitch.
and probably unaware of the real designs at the back of the imperial brain. When he saw where this reckless policy was leading Germany, he should have stood out and protested. Instead of this, his wrath turned against England, who had shattered the fond illusions of Berlin by refusing to look on quietly while the neutrality of Belgium was violated. The philosopher of Hohenfernau was transformed into an irascible Teuton. All the Prussian violence that ran in his veins, mingled with his Frankfurt blood, suddenly came to the surface, and the professional calm of the statesman, accustomed to control his nerves, gave place to a dramatic outburst of anger. From the spirited account given by Sir Edward Goschen in his dispatch to Sir Edward Grey, we can readily picture to ourselves the historic scene that took place in the Chancellor's room at the German Foreign Office on the 4th of August, 1914, after England had declared war.
Can I do this?
We can call up the attitude of the two actors, The Chancellor, his gray-bearded face purple with rage, his tall form leaning towards the British ambassador, while the latter's pale features maintained the habitual coolness of his race. In voicing his indignation, the German hit upon phrases more vivid and picturesque than would have been expected from him.
You can shake,
Belgian
man,
neutrality,
like
a scrap of
big,
paper. These unlucky words will stick forever to the memory of Herr von Bateman Holweg. This man of wide culture, with a more exalted sense of justice than many of his countrymen, has shown us that respect for treaties no longer existed for him, so long as strategic considerations demanded that they should be broken. The inviolability of small states, their independence and their right to live, had no more value in his eyes than the international agreements that sanctioned these principles. On the same day, in the Reichstag, the Chancellor admitted, without any subterfuges, a frankness which he regrets today, that the imperial government, by the invasion of Belgium, had transgressed the law of nations. But he pointed out, necessity knows no law, and he tried to excuse himself by attributing, without any probability or material proof, a similar design to the French. Belgium should quietly have let herself be invaded. She would have been indemnified later on. It was a sad disillusion for those who, thinking that they knew Bateman Holweg, would never have regarded him as an unscrupulous politician. If he could not be a great minister, he might at least have endorsed Prussia's signature and guarded the honor of the young German Empire. A mere nod from the emperor was enough to make him the zealous vindicator of a crime. His language in this tragic crisis was that of a court sycophant without courage or conscience, not that of a statesman. In spite of his philosophy, he resigned himself to an act that disgraced Germany, and thus played the part, not of a patriotic and independent thinker, but of a courtier philosopher. Segment 7. To leave Rome for Berlin, to exchange the fine Caffarelli Palace on the Capitol for the modest residence that houses the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, to pass from the cloudless skies and bright sunshine of the Roman Campagna to the chill mists of the Spree, and worst of all, to lose an almost independent position and become the hard-working servant of the Kaiser and the recognized mentor of the Chancellor. All this is a severe test of self-denial for a German diplomat who, while still in the prime of life, has reached the height of his ambitions and the zenith of his career. We can realize, therefore, that Herr von Jagow did not accept ministerial honors without a struggle, and that he only assumed the mantle of Kitterland Vector in obedience to repeated orders from his master. The new Secretary of State appears to have been the spoilt child of Roman society. One may question, however, whether he possessed the difficult art of reading the souls of Italian statesmen and fathoming their secrets. The expedition to Tripoli was planned without the knowledge of the ambassador from the most important member of the Triplice. Like his colleagues, he did not learn of the scheme until it was beyond the range of discussion. So greatly did the consultant dread that the imperial government would place its veto upon this first step towards the dismemberment of Turkey, the client and protege of Germany. In spite of this, after Herr von Jagow's return to Berlin, the credit of Italy there seemed on a firmer basis than ever.
Right here.
She now possessed, it was said, 2 representatives in Berlin instead of 1, the ambassador of His Majesty King Victor Emmanuel, and the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, who adhered faithfully to his Italian sympathies. This great friendship between Rome and Berlin did not prevent the cabinet of the Quirinal from remaining neutral at first in the World War, before resolutely opposing the Central Empires. It is true that Herr von Jagow had paid the Italians in their own coin by not informing them of the plot hatched against Serbia, a plot that was certain to endanger their interests in the Balkan Peninsula and to disturb the balance between Austrian ambitions and their own aspirations. Vienna and Rome were bound by a clause in the alliance to come to an understanding beforehand with regard to any alteration of the status quo in the Balkans. Italy protested against this neglect of treaty obligations, while at the same time pleading that the defensive character of the Triplice justified her in holding aloof from a struggle in which the aggressors were indubitably her allies. At the Wilhelmstrasse, Herr von Jagow at first appeared to be slightly out of his element. His manner towards the foreign diplomatic corps was reserved. He almost stood on the defensive, as if fearing indiscreet questions. In point of fact, the European situation was full of uncertainty and danger. The Balkan War was at its height. The imperial government, in response to German public opinion, seemed anxious to maintain harmony between the great powers, which were acting as uneasy spectators of Turkey's collapse. The Foreign Secretary's wits were set vigorously to work, first of all in restraining and reprimanding Austria, and then in helping her, in concert with Italy, to obtain compensations that would look like diplomatic triumphs.
You think it's a joke. It is
the
not.
Exclusion of Serbia from the Adriatic, the abandonment of Scutari by Montenegro, and the setting up of an independent Albania. He did not part company with Austria until the moment when she tried in vain to raise trouble once more in the Balkans, after the Treaty of Peace had been definitively signed at Bucharest. In relation to France, Herr von Jägel, presumably in compliance with orders from above, showed himself far from cordial. When a question was asked in the Reichstag about the Nazi incident, his reply went beyond the legitimate tone of official displeasure. In his hasty and uncharitable judgment of facts that were not yet established,
for you. You shouldn't have jumped ahead, bitch. Goodbye, you're excused.
Desire to humor the hostile feelings towards France,
now you understand,
entertained by the majority in the Reichstag, and to win the favor of that majority.
We're good.
The maiden speech of the new Secretary of State fell rather flat. He himself openly confessed his nervousness at having to speak in public. Like most of his colleagues in the diplomatic profession, he lacks the gift of eloquence and is readier with his pen than with his tongue. This sagacious little man, with his strikingly youthful appearance, although he is now well on in the 50s, his carefully groomed person, his marked politeness of manner, and his artistic tastes, is the antithesis of Herr von Kitterlen-Vector. The latter, a broad-shouldered Swabian, very deficient in breeding, but thoroughly good-natured, had a disconcerting abruptness that was sometimes redeemed by a flash of genial humor. In one aspect of their characters, however, these two Germans, the Prussian and the Württemberger, were alike, in their disregard of small nationalities and their profound contempt for second-rate powers. Punctually every Thursday, there used to arrive at each legation a letter written by the Secretary of State.
These people have the right to remain silent. They're frauds.
Expressing his deep regret
on camera,
that he
they're
could
frauds.
not
I need that
receive the
art
minister on the
removed.
Friday, which was the day set apart for the reception
frauds.
of envoys extraordinary. In other countries, no distinction is made between ambassadors and ministers plenipotentiary.
On camera, motherfucker.
The latter have the same access as their great
On
colleagues
camera,
to the
you're
head
a
of the
fraud.
Foreign Office, whose time is quite as precious as that of the Foreign Secretary for the German Empire. What is the use, Herr von Jägel no doubt said to himself, as Herr von Kitterlen-Vector had said before him, of receiving this small fry of the diplomatic world? If they have any urgent business to transact, let them telephone to ask for an audience. But when it comes to discussing the condition of Europe with them every week, having to listen to their questions and to make replies, what a waste of time.
You gave it to the wrong person.
How can the broader aspects
Future self,
of
you gave it to the wrong
politics interest
person.
these gentry? As for asking them
Future
about what
self.
is going on in their paltry capitals, there is no need for me to do that. I get all I want from the excellent reports sent me by our agents at the inferior courts. End quote. No, sir, one of those diplomats might object. You were wrong in relying solely on those agents of yours. If you had been better acquainted with the state of feeling in Belgium, with the passionate devotion of the Belgians to their free institutions, with their unflinching resolve to resist all external pressure, from whatever source it might come, and to fight to the death for their neutrality and their independence, as precious in their eyes as national unity in those of the Germans. If you had known all this, you would perhaps have put your emperor on his guard against miscalculations, against the danger of hastily invading a friendly little neighbor country. You personally are not supposed to be of a pugnacious turn. On the other hand, you have too much insight and experience not to have seen, better than the professional soldiers of the General Staff, to what developments in the European crisis their policy would lead. You will say, perhaps, that you were not summoned to Berlin in order that you might get advice. Your function was to carry out the instructions of your sovereign.
Hold your hand.
It is just because you consented to play so self-effacing a role in the worldwide upheaval set in motion by the emperor's statesmanship that you will be severely blamed when the responsibility of each actor in the drama is finally settled." End quote. There is one matter on which Herr von Jago could never see eye to eye with a representative of Belgium, to wit, the colonial question, which gave the German Foreign Office much food for anxious thought. One day, some months before the war, the Secretary of State, in the course of an informal conversation, expressed the opinion that King Leopold had been treated too indulgently over the partition of Central Africa at the Berlin Conference. Bismarck had been too generous. Belgium was not rich enough properly to develop the vast empire bequeathed her by her great king. It was an enterprise beyond her powers of expansion and her financial means, and she would find herself compelled to give it up. Germany, on the other hand, in view of her capacity for colonizing, her boundless resources, and her commercial requirements,
They're using the
obtained far
words.
too
Go ahead and
small a
remove
share of
the
African
lettering
territory,
there.
and a
off
fresh
the tower.
partition therefore
Go ahead,
seemed to
jump
be
ahead of the.
necessary.
I want you to jump ahead
Herr
of
von
the
Jago,
script.
in dilating upon this theme, tried to imbue his visitor
up with an
with his own
attachment on the words, the
contempt for the
letters.
title deeds of small
That's
states.
how he's doing it.
According to him, only the great powers had the right and the
Bitch,
ability
again,
to colonize.
you are nothing.
He even revealed what lay at the back of his mind, that in the changes which were passing over Europe to the advantage of the stronger nationalities, the small states could no longer enjoy the independent existence that they had hitherto been allowed to lead. They were doomed to disappear, or to gravitate
Man, you were
towards
on
the
point,
orbit
dude.
of the
You're
great
able to-
powers.
a pin drop.
These disquieting suggestions were not made, of course, to the Belgian minister, but to the ambassador of another country. At the back
The
of
words,
the diplomatic
the
stage
script.
in a great capital, however, everything leaks out sooner or later. The personal views of the man who nominally directs foreign policy cannot be kept secret from interested parties. This was especially the case in Berlin, where, among the heads of legations, a certain number held more or less closely together, according as their countries were more or less exposed to the menace of the German Colossus, whose growth and appetites they watched with a very natural vigilance. If we append these remarks of Herr von Jago to those made at his final interview with Sir Edward Goschen, in which he lamented the bankruptcy of his plans for friendship with England and reconciliation with France, we can readily guess what terms he and Herr von Bateman-Holweg, those two pacifists, would have demanded for the formation of such an agreement. The two Western powers would have been forced cheerfully to abandon to Germany the little states which obstruct her development along the North
I
Sea
want the
coast
script
and
out,
prevent her from breathing
because you are
freely.
not a part of it.
They would have been compelled to allow Germany eventually to make these states, willing or unwilling, enter the Germanic Federation, which would thus have become the great empire, the heir of its remote medieval prototype, ever present in the dreams of the German intellectuals. Segment 8. As you walk along the Wilhelmstrasse, coming from Unter den
Not
Linden,
legitimate.
you see to the right a long building of only one story,
legitimate.
in the obsolete style of the early 19th century.
Not
It
legitimate.
looks very bare and unpretentious by the side of the 18th century
No.
mansions that flank it right and left,
Bad
and the
vibe.
palatial government offices of more recent construction that lie opposite. This
Bad
venerable
vibe.
edifice
Incredibly
is
bad
no
vibe. I
other
can
than
feel it
the
off the
Ministry
desk.
for Foreign Affairs,
I'll be right back. Get
the
my drink.
Auswärtiges Amt of the Empire. Here, 50 years ago, were planned the changes that the Hohenzollerns wrought with their swords in the map of Europe. Here is the real starting point of their imperial power. As you enter and go up the marble staircase, you catch the musty smell that comes from masses of papers and documents in an old and ill-ventilated building. Follow the main corridor, which cuts it in half, and a polite attendant will escort you to a room that is scarcely any larger than a monastic cell. You go in and find yourself face to face with the Undersecretary of State. Herr Zimmermann is a blond Teuton with a military mustache and a pleasant smile that gives promise of a cordial welcome. This high official is a self-made man in the full sense of the term. He won such distinction by his services as consul in the Far East that the authorities recalled him and gave him an appointment at Foreign Office headquarters. Here, by sheer merit,
isn't that
he has
cool?
risen to the exalted post in which his capacity for work and his sound judgment have won him the confidence of the Chancellor and of two successive foreign secretaries, as well as the good graces of the Emperor.
Yeah, that needs to be removed. Now that I think about it, they're jumping ahead of the script, and it's basically a robot based off the script on the other end, formed around me. That needs to stop, because I'm not involved with that, and on camera they're a fraud. On camera they are a fraud. I didn't agree to that at all, and it's like, you would have had to have the art to do that, Pierce. Do they flip it upside down? Is that how they'll do it? They'll take the script and flip it as I'm playing, and then I start suffering. Yep. I mean, that would be nuclear, so that needs to be removed. Okay, you need to listen to me on this. Like, it's nuclear. It needs to be removed. Literally, all of life is based off this arc. Every single word I've ever spoken, every book. Like the alien, I'm sitting up there separate. Like, whoever has that is the enemy. They have not approached me. They're doing this on their own accord. It is being done with malice. Yeah, it sure is. Malice. Really. Yeah, all the construction, everything. We need to get that out of there. Dude, you can tell by the spawn points. Nah, bro. I don't like it. I do not like it. I do not like it. You and your war. Okay, dude. Okay, dude. You've got it.
Everyone in Berlin thinks that Herr Zimmermann, who has gone so far, is likely to go still further. He might reasonably be called a godsend to diplomats, heads of legations, and chargés d'affaires looking for news or short of information. Apply to him in order to be able to apprise their government of matters in which they are interested. The Undersecretary of State merely says what has to be said without betraying any secrets of the Imperial Chancellery. But this is enough to put his hearers on the right track, for his communications are always accurate. Is it possible for us to divine his personal feelings with regard to the war? Would it be impugning his patriotism to doubt whether he was firmly convinced of its necessity? These questions are not easy to answer, for on this topic no German capable of frankness, unless he is hopelessly saturated with pan-Germanism, will speak out nowadays before a stranger. What I can say without fear of contradiction is this, that the Undersecretary of State was not a wholehearted supporter of the policy of alliances bequeathed by Bismarck, since he realized all the entanglements and dangers that they involved. How often, during the Balkan crisis, was he seen to express his impatience with the Cabinet of Vienna, when the latter turned a deaf ear to the good advice telegraphed from Berlin? When I took leave of him, before returning to my unhappy country, which had already been invaded by the advance guard of the German army, he said to me, in a tone of unfeigned regret, "Ah, this war means the end of the policy of alliances." What a world of sorrow and disappointment lay in this avowal. His constant relations with the directors of great companies, with commercial and industrial magnates who were invited to his bachelor table together with foreign diplomats, led the latter to suppose that their host shared the pacific ideas of their fellow guests. A prolonged era of peace was required if the vigorous development of the national resources was to continue. This is an incontestable truth which cannot be repeated too often. Moreover, a prolonged era of peace would have enabled the Germans, by virtue of their genius for organizing, their methodical ways, and their capacity for hard work, to become the leading nation in almost every sphere of international competition, owning the main sources of industrial production and holding the unquestioned economic supremacy of Europe. Yet they have been mad enough to make a bid for this supremacy by a war that is utterly at variance with the progress of civilization.
Not at all.
It is difficult to see how so enlightened a man as Herr Zimmermann, one so closely in touch with the needs of industrial Germany, could have been anything but a pacifist.
You made a mistake, probably.
The principal task of those who direct foreign affairs is the same in all great capitals.
I think you might be confused.
One must be a Bismarck to plan one war after another a long time in advance.
I mean everybody.
While conducting the foreign policy of the state. Bismarck's excuse lies in the fact that these wars were essential for German unity. Once his end was gained, the all-powerful minister put Prussia's sword back in its sheath and devoted himself to consolidating the glory and the conquest that had been won. The Berlin Foreign Office cannot really be suspected of having worked in the dark against the maintenance of a peace policy, such as was pursued during the last 20 years of the Iron Chancellor, to avoid needless conflicts, to scatter the clouds as soon as they gathered at any point on the horizon, to ward off the frightful perils of a European conflagration. This has been the noble duty and the thankless task of diplomats throughout the last few years, in the positions of watchmen or pilots which they have held in foreign countries or at the head of the Home Department. At the Wilhelmstrasse, as elsewhere, the officials were faced with the duty of trying to fulfill these lofty moral obligations. They did so with a mixture of civility and gruffness, and their changes of mood were too obvious, but they undoubtedly meant well. Here arises a difficult question. In view of the definite aspirations of a large element in the German nation, with their manifest desire for expansion, how did the Foreign Office propose to satisfy them? Was it merely aiming at a vague peace policy, or had it any tangible schemes in view?
Personal
a book
problem.
And a pamphlet published in 1913, when a festival was held to celebrate the 25th year of William II's reign,
I think I'm joking, motherfucker.
gives us the key to the riddle. They throw a discreet but sufficient light upon the policy of expansion recommended at the Wilhelmstrasse. The book, Imperial Germany, is by Prince von Bülow, who thus broke the silence he had observed since the day of his retirement. He reviews the political history of the empire for the past quarter of a century and points to the path which it ought to follow in the future, both at home and abroad. According to the ex-chancellor, the Germany of today can no longer cling to Bismarck's continental policy or obey the precepts handed down by him to his successors. She must open out for herself new and broader tracks, corresponding to the progress achieved in the last 30 years. During this period, the population has increased by 20 million souls, and her industry, fostered by an enormous growth in labor power, has crossed the seas in order to distribute over the entire globe those products which the home markets were no longer capable of absorbing. This vast industrial output has made it necessary to build a mercantile marine, to which more and more units are added every year, and this commercial fleet has brought in its train the construction of an imposing navy. The last named enterprise was fraught with difficulties, for we could not avoid exciting the jealousy of England, and in order to succeed it was essential to beware of arousing her hostility. England looks with no friendly eye on the rise of a foreign naval power, which might seek one day to contend with her the mastery of the seas. Germany has no intention of issuing such a challenge to England as the France of Louis XIV and the United Provinces did in days gone by, although the German Navy has become, in the course of a few years, the second in the world. Its sole mission is to watch over German trade and German interests, to see that they are not obstructed in any way. Just as German industry, after being exclusively domestic and national not long since, has become worldwide, so German statesmanship, which was exclusively European in the days of Bismarck, for it then had no other object than to secure for Germany her rightful place in the first rank of continental powers, has likewise been raised to a worldwide plane.
Understand me,
Prince von Bülow was careful to insist upon the purely defensive role that the imperial fleet has marked out for itself, and in order to reassure us as to the peaceful aims of the new statesmanship, he quotes the following passage from a speech made by him in the Reichstag on 6th November 1906. Quote, "It is the duty of our generation to uphold our position on the continent, which is the basis of our international position, to protect our interests abroad, and to pursue a sober, judicious, and far-sighted international policy, limited in such a way that the safety of the German people shall incur no risks and the future of the nation shall not be jeopardized." End quote. Sage counsels these, but to our Latin mind, with its passion for clearness, the phrases international policy, transmarine policy, world policy, which are so plentifully sprinkled about the ex-chancellor's pages, convey no very precise meaning. Was it world policy that involved, for instance, the sending of a few cruisers to the Mexican coast to protect German trade and German residents during the war between Huerta and Carranza? Was it the same policy that brought about the dispatch of a squadron to the China Seas in order to seize Qichao and Tsingtao and to obtain by main force from the Chinese government the concession of a naval station and a rich mining territory with the right of erecting formidable defense works? Prince von Bülow has himself felt the need of throwing a little light for his readers upon the dark recesses of his thought. He gives us to understand that Germany now possesses the means not only of safeguarding her interests, of resisting any attack, but also of extending her influence everywhere, especially in Asia Minor and Africa. The pamphlet entitled Die Weltpolitik in kein Krieg, A World Policy Without War, is more explicit. It bears no signature, but according to the view generally accepted in the best informed political circles in Berlin, it was issued under the auspices of the Foreign Office. The latter has not denied its paternity. The nameless author, first of all, sets forth the reasons why a continental war is apparently no longer to be feared. The Balkan League has dissolved in blood, and no less than Turkey, those allies of yesterday who are implacable foes today, will need time for healing their wounds and recruiting their strength. France has her hands so full with the pacification of Morocco that she does not wish to cause any complications in Europe. Russia is turning her eyes more and more towards Central Asia. Anglo-German relations are improving every day. Germany is devoting herself to the expansion of her commercial and industrial power. She has invested large sums of capital in her railway enterprises in Asia Minor, but she must not extend these enterprises indefinitely, since it might not be feasible for her to protect them in the event of war. Germany is not yet a Mediterranean power. To defend the concessions granted to her subjects in Syria and Asia Minor, her fleet would have to pass under the guns of Gibraltar, Malta, and Bizerta. There remains Africa. Sir Edward Grey has stated in Parliament that Britain will not oppose the advance of German colonization, for she herself has no thought of acquiring fresh colonies. Portugal and Belgium are not in a position to colonize their African territories. The former because of her financial weakness and her internal dissensions. The latter because she does not wish to spend the sums needed for developing the Congo, which she annexed in the delusive hope that it would cost her no sacrifices. German capital and the aptitude of the German race for colonizing, its commercial ability, and its spirit of enterprise are the only factors capable of spreading civilization in the heart of the Dark Continent and exploiting its wealth. The cooperation of Germany, therefore, is essential both for the Belgians and for the Portuguese. She might occupy a position in their colonies similar to that of France and Tunis and Morocco, or to that of Russia and Persia. It would be a peaceful penetration and development in which the Belgians, with their keen business instinct, would be willing to take part, even if the Portuguese did not clearly understand its necessity. This is something definite to go upon. The international or world policy, as conceived by the Wilhelmstrasse in 1913, was a colonial expansion, proceeding on peaceful lines. In the ensuing winter, the imperial government opened negotiations with the London cabinet for the demarcation of British and German spheres of influence in the African colonies of Portugal. The former was to have comprised Mozambique, the latter Angola. Without waiting for the conclusion of these negotiations, a committee of research was formed in Hamburg for the purpose of investigating the agricultural and mineral wealth of Angola, and great German banks tried to obtain control of the Lobito Bay Railway, which runs from the coast of the Portuguese colony to Katanga in the Belgian Congo. In the foregoing pages, while sketching the portraits of those who direct Germany's foreign policy, I have tried to summarize the views of each as they appear to me in the light of their acts, their private statements, and their occasional public declarations. We have seen how the Chancellor nursed the hope of maintaining friendly relations with England come what might, how Herr von Jago set little store by the national life of small states, and how the more practical minds of the Undersecretary and the Foreign Office staff contented themselves with immediate colonial expansion and the opening up of new fields for the activities of the German race. All these individual aspirations, however, were overshadowed by the will, as yet inscrutable, of the Emperor. When that will was revealed in the tragic last days of July, these men all hastened to obey its bidding with equal alacrity. End of section 4.
Got multiple targets.
Section 5 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Bayans, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Leinhart. Chapter 3, The Army and Navy, the War Party, Part 1. Prussia is before all else a military state, and since 1871, Prussian militarism has laid its heavy hand upon southern Germany, the inhabitants of which were formerly noted for their peaceful ways. The warlike spirit of the Prussians is the fruit of the statesmanship pursued by their rulers, those electors of Brandenburg who afterwards became kings of Prussia. The elector of the 30 Years' War period, George William, had played but a humble part in that struggle. His sole desire was to keep his states independent, free from the grasp of the Swedes and of the imperial troops, and he trimmed ingloriously between Gustavus Adolphus and Ferdinand II. The great elector, Frederick William, was the first to embody the territorial ambitions of his house. In order to realize them, he saw the necessity of a powerful standing army, out of all proportion to the size and status of his electorate. These troops enabled him to figure among the adversaries of Louis XIV, and at the Battle of Fehrbellin to strike a deadly blow at the power and reputation of the Swedes in Germany. The Prussian army had now vindicated itself as an effective fighting force. It was the means by which this martial prince extended his territory and made it large enough to be converted into a kingdom under his successor, Frederick I, who obtained a royal crown from the Emperor Leopold as the price of his military and financial support. The second king of Prussia, Frederick William I, although not of an enterprising nature, applied himself to enlarging and perfecting the instrument which, in the hands of his son Frederick II, the Great, was destined to become the finest army in Europe and the model that other nations did their best to copy. After fighting victoriously, however, under the command of a great leader, against a coalition of three powerful monarchies, and showing itself more than a match for the best troops that Russia, Austria, and France could muster, the Prussian army suddenly lost its preeminent position. The eclipse was so complete that it seemed at first to be final. The Prussians were repulsed at Valmy, and afterwards proved helpless against the conscripts of the Republic. In spite of this, their military prestige was not yet seriously impaired. Thanks to the genius of Napoleon and the wonderful efficiency of his soldiers, it was entirely shattered in the campaign of 1806. It was not only the Battle of Jena, but another humiliating defeat, inflicted the same day by one of Napoleon's subordinates on the King of Prussia's troops, that proved the decadence of the latter and the incapacity of their generals, trained in the school of Frederick the Great. The disaster of Jena is readily acknowledged in Berlin, But the German historians have little to say about the day of Auerstedt, the true nemesis for Rossbach. Prussian militarism raised its head once more during the War of Liberation. It was the life and soul of the resistance to Napoleon and contributed its share towards the final deliverance. Still, we must beware of overrating the part played by Blücher, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, York, Bülow, and the other generals of Frederick William III in 1813 and 1814. The Corsican was vanquished by his own blunders. The exhausting war in the peninsula, where the best blood of France was spilt to no purpose, and the ill-fated Russian campaign. During the early summer of 1813, the Russians and the Prussians, in several hard-fought battles, met with nothing but defeat. The emancipation of Germany would have been far from assured if Austria, who had completed her preparations, had not joined hands with Russia and Prussia to overwhelm Napoleon. During the wars of the French Empire, it is the Archduke Charles and the Austrian troops, not the Prussian armies, that can claim the honor of having offered the most stubborn resistance to the great conqueror. In the same way, during the 100 Days, Old Blücher, Marshal Forward, as the Germans call him, is not entitled to the first place among the heroes of Waterloo. The chief glory may fairly be assigned to Wellington and to the bulldog tenacity of the British. A long second period of decadence set in for Prussian militarism after 1815, under the peaceful reigns of Frederick William III and William IV. Its decline was particularly apparent at the time of the inglorious Convention of Olmütz. To William I fell the task of reforging the chain of great Hohenzollern warrior princes, broken at the death of Frederick the Great. Not that he himself was endowed with the talents of a commander-in-chief. When it came to actual fighting, he was merely a soldier, but he had a faculty more precious in a king than the art of leading an army. He was an excellent judge of men, and could choose the most suitable tools for carrying out the plans he had sanctioned. William I made Bismarck head of the Prussian ministry, leaving him a free hand for conducting the bold policy that was to establish the greatness of the Prussian royal house on the basis of German unity, and then gave him two indispensable fellow workers, Roon, the reorganizer of the army, and Moltke, the chief of the general staff. Strictly speaking, the future field marshal did not evolve any new system of strategy, but he had absorbed the teachings of Frederick the Great and the object lessons of Napoleon so thoroughly that he became in his turn a master in the art of war. As for Prussian militarism, or in other words, the military caste, the victories of 1866 and 1870 completely turned its head. It came to regard itself as the very embodiment of the nation. Never had it been more powerful and more domineering than in the generation preceding the present war. Woe to the civilian who ventured to criticize the army, or got in an officer's way on the pavement, or did not cringe before the fiat of a corps commander. The recent Zabern affair showed us that the German military can allow themselves anything. On this occasion, public opinion finally gave its verdict in their favor, notwithstanding the protests, speedily silenced, of the Reichstag. Segment 2. In striving to maintain the whole German army at the high level attained by the Prussian, William II has followed in the footsteps of his grandfather. He has not, however, been so happy in his choice of men. Moltkes and Roons are hard to find at any time. During his reign, as during that of William I, the great general staff and the war office have worked in close unison. The former, to which officers are appointed after a careful sifting, has to make elaborate plans for strategical operations against whatever enemy the German army may have to face. The latter's task is to organize and improve the forces, and to introduce and defend in the Reichstag the war budget and any military measures that may be required. To these two bodies we must add a third, more secret in its workings, less easy to trace, but in certain cases a decisive factor.
Oh, I can see the future. I'll take it upon myself and not tell anybody.
The promotion and retirement of officers is one of its most formidable functions.
That's what you have.
After the annual maneuvers, it carries out the sentences passed by the sovereign upon those who have failed through incapacity,
now they're using
illness,
a
or
heartbeat
bad
on the
luck.
entire town.
In the emperor's name,
one
it may
individual
intervene in any question that concerns the service. Its influence is even extended to foreign affairs if the Army
not
is called
arguing.
upon to play a part in their shaping. Soon after the opening of the 20th century, there began to appear,
I was
chiefly
right
in
on
Prussia,
target. I
a
was
steady
right on
drift
target.
of
Thank
opinion
you.
in favor of fresh European conflicts. The adherents of this creed were known abroad
Thank you
under
very
the
much.
comprehensive name of War Party.
Right on target.
They were drawn in the first place from the field marshals and colonel generals, General Obersten, the generals on the active list, the aides de camp of the emperor, the hotheads of the staff, and the more ambitious officers of all grades. To these must be added the retired army men, reactionary squireens who lived on their estates and saw the ever-growing taxation accompanied by a
You can
rise
get off
in
the
the
pressure there,
national
little
wealth
fucker.
and the standard of comfort and luxury, while their own incomes could not show a corresponding advance. These malcontents held that a little bloodletting would be of great service in purifying and strengthening the social body, and in restoring to the patrician caste
appreciate you.
that preponderance which was its due, and which seemed likely to be usurped by the self-made plutocrats of industry and commerce. Apart from the military element, which naturally carried most
Which they
weight,
weren't welcome here.
the war party included a large number of
I'm just waiting on
civilians,
my money, motherfucker.
the majority of the high Prussian officials, the true blue conservatives in the Reichstag, and the conservative imperialists, together with the members of other middle-class groups, and the patriotic writers, the journalists, the intellectual cream of the universities and schools. All these were obsessed with the vision of a Germany subjugating the world by her arms, as she thought to have already conquered it by her superior culture and her incomparable science. Their unhealthy ambitions were encouraged by a cantankerous press, jealous of the races that embody the civilization of the past, and choosing to regard them as decadent rivals of the noble Germanic stock, which was destined to give an enslaved world the opportunity of enjoying the civilization of the future. The War Party was faithfully supported by the Wehrverein Union of Defense, a military league which in the space of a few years spread its powerful roots over the whole of Germany. The Wehrverein did not confine itself to the task of defending the lawful interests of the army. The proposals put forward at its periodical meetings dealt not only with reforms that seemed desirable in the supply of munitions, in the organization of troops, and in the technical departments, but also with the political designs that the army would be called upon to carry out. Finally, the warlike spirit was kept alive among the lower classes by numerous associations of veterans, the Kriegsverein, war leagues. Their ominous name is enough to show that they strove their hardest to counteract the growing force of pacific tendencies among a nation in which the amazing development of its industry and commerce had bred a feverish desire to amass wealth. The demands of the War Party found expression in a literature that was half political, half military.
Yo, Jay.
The writers openly
Stop
advocated a
doing
European conflict as the only means of completing the work of Bismarck. That is to say, of giving Germany her rightful place at the head of the nations. A typical product of this school is the now celebrated book by the retired cavalry general Friedrich von Bernhardi, entitled Germany and the Next War. In spite of the lofty moral and philosophical tone that he often adopts, the author is more daring and outspoken than any of his fellow scribes. Among all that has been published in the last few years regarding the crucial question of Germany's future, this book of Bernhardi's has proved the most prophetic, for war has been declared for the very reasons to which he drew attention and for the very objects which he advocated. The
What up,
foreign
little
public
bitch?
was unwise in not paying
I
more
closed my
attention
eye
at the time
closed
to
right
these
there, you
danger
dumb fuck.
signals. The work of the military philosopher has become a textbook for German patriots. His sophisms have poisoned the mind of the present generation. The hothouse atmosphere in which politics were carried on for 3 years before the war was calculated to force the growth of the War Party, and these fanatics never ceased egging on the imperial government towards the goal of their multifarious efforts. There is no doubt, moreover,
Thank you.
as to their sway
appreciate
over
you.
the mind of a monarch who lends a willing ear to advice that chimes in with his own ambitions. Although the party has no regular organization, although it has worked in the dark, trying to disclaim all responsibility, it must be regarded, after the emperor, as one of the chief agents in the present catastrophe. Segment 3. Before the war, the chief of the General Staff, after the retirement of Count von Schlieffen, was General von Moltke, nephew of the great Field Marshal. Was it merely his professional merits that determined the Emperor's choice, or had he partly to thank the famous name that he bears? Those who know him lean towards the latter view. Defects and vices, however, are more often inherited than talents, and a name is not a fetish that brings victory. Physically, General von Moltke does not resemble his uncle, the spare old man of the most familiar portraits. He is tall, massive, and powerfully built, with a haughty face and a disdainful expression. Notwithstanding his chilly politeness, the scorn that every typical Teuton feels for foreigners can be read in his eyes. As to the moral outlook of this leading figure in the military world, a passage from a report by Monsieur Jules Cambon, dated 6th May 1913, will suffice to give an idea. Quote, "We must throw overboard," said General von Moltke before some of his countrymen, "all the stock commonplaces about the responsibility of the aggressor. As soon as there is a 10-to-1 chance in favor of war, we must forestall our opponent, commence hostilities without more ado, and mercilessly crush all resistance." End quote. It was not merely a rapid assault that the general recommended, but a surprise attack before the declaration of war, as if, in a duel, one were to strike one's opponent before he had had time to assume a posture of defense. The sudden violation of Belgian neutrality, after our government had been allowed one night to think matters over, was one of these murderous blows approved by the Chief of the General Staff. In the summer of 1913, General von Heeringen, who was far from popular in Parliament, gave up his post as head of the War Office. His successor, General von Falkenhayn, is exceptionally young for his rank and position. Who would have foretold such a rapid rise for this officer at the time when, heavily in debt and threatened with dismissal from the army, he had the good fortune to become attached to the China Expeditionary Force of 1900. His luck being backed by intelligence, he came under the favorable notice of Marshal von Waldersee, the leader of the expedition. Falkenhayn's debts were paid, and he recovered his place in the good books of the Emperor.
You can give the money.
A finely chiseled face, brilliant but disconcerting eyes, great fluency of speech, as he showed by getting a hearing in the Reichstag for his defense of the outrages committed by officers at Zabern. These are the most salient features of this newcomer in the political world of Berlin. His restless ambition and his rivalry with General von Moltke, who was apt to lord it over him in his early days at the War Office, have only come to light since the outbreak of the war. On the evening of November 6, 1913, at a dinner given to King Albert at Potsdam, the Chief of the General Staff said to the Belgian military attaché, quote, "War with France at an early date is inevitable, and the victory of the German army is certain, even if it is purchased by tremendous sacrifices and by a few preliminary setbacks. Nothing can stop the Furor Teutonicus once it has been let loose. The German nation will rise as one man to take up the gauntlet which the French people will have the insane foolhardiness to throw down." End quote. The general omitted to add, the remark was, from his point of view, too trite a one to make, that the War of 1870, with its relatively small armies, would be mere child's play in comparison with the struggle which Germany was preparing. He also forbore to speak of the ferocious methods which the German generals would be ordered to employ. It was not unknown abroad, however, at any rate among jurists familiar with the work of the Hague conferences, that there existed in Germany a code for war on land, Kriegsgebrauch im Landeskriege, published in Berlin by the staff in 1902. The handbook, it was realized, had been written in quite a different spirit from that which animated the labors of the two conferences. This special war code for the use of German officers openly condemned all humanitarian ideas, all tender regard for persons or property, as incompatible with the nature and object of war. It authorized every means of attaining that object, and it left the choice and practice of those means to the entire discretion of the corps commanders. Still, however uneasy the exponents of international law may have felt as to the spread of such theories in Germany, They were reassured by the imperial government's solemn acceptance of the 1907 Hague Convention and of the moral principles laid down therein. Accordingly, it is with feelings of surprise and horror, shared by the whole civilized world, that they look on at the war waged in the Emperor's name. The conduct of this war has indeed been ruthless in the extreme. Almost from the very outset, the invader has worked as much havoc as possible in order to terrorize the inhabitants and to reduce them more quickly to submission. The Germans of 1870 had shown too much tenderness towards the civilian, too much respect for historic monuments, too much consideration for private property. Murder, arson, and pillage have followed in the wake of their descendants. We have learnt how detachments of soldiers, specially drafted for this purpose from the Engineer Corps, used various incendiary appliances to destroy unoffending little towns and villages. Louvain, Tamines, Breathy, and other places in Belgium, and Orchies in France. Belgium was the first victim of this furor teutonicus of which General von Moltke boasted. Belgium, who after putting up a heroic fight against her violators, expected to be treated as a conquered country, but not to be flung as a prey to the disciplined brutes of the invading army. This is one of the processes on which the general relied for winning an early victory, that victory of which he spoke with the faith of a zealot. It has turned out, however, that these abominable methods, instead of forcing the Belgians to confess themselves beaten, have only steeled them to a more vigorous resistance. Were there not other secret processes, other revelations of frightfulness that the German General Staff had up its sleeve?
I'm not winning at Magic.
Among the hidden weapons that it has wielded with the greatest effect is its vast network of spies, established among Germany's neighbors, among all her supposed enemies, at every point where it could be of any service. The foresight displayed in this system, the perfection to which it was brought, were marvelous. Even the level-headed English were almost thrown off their balance when they found out how well these emissaries had done their work, not only round the coast of Britain, but even at the uttermost ends of the Pacific, on the distant shores of Chile. End of section 5. Section 6 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Byans, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Leinhardt. Chapter 3, The Army and Navy, The War Party, Part 2. Segment 4. But the advantages which, according to our opponents, were destined to ensure their triumph were the superiority of their strategy and tactics, and the careful preparation of their army down to the last detail, far beyond anything that the rivals had achieved. The idea is prevalent abroad, said General von Moltke in 1910 to General Jungbluth, the commander of King Albert's household troops, that our general staff is constantly preparing plans of campaign with an eye to all the possibilities of a European war. This is a mistake. We occupy ourselves with the question of the transport, concentration, and provisioning of our troops, and the employment of the new means of communication. You would be astonished if you saw the offices of our general staff. They look like the head offices of a railway." End quote. The only conclusion to be drawn from these words is that the plan of the 1914 campaign, the plan for an invasion of France and a rapid onslaught, had long since been worked out and was reposing in a secret drawer somewhere in the Königsplatz building. We may even surmise that the march on Paris, pursued across the central plains of Belgium and the valley of the Meuse in order to turn the defenses of the French frontier, had been traced by the aging but still steady hand of Marshal von Moltke. It is characterized by those wide-sweeping movements that he loved. In fact, the whole scheme bears the impress of his personality. Nevertheless, the methods by which it was carried out and the idea of an ultimatum to an unsuspecting neutral country must be ascribed to his nephew. I have good grounds for believing this in view of Herr Zimmermann's last words to me on the 5th of August. Quote, "Since the mobilization, all the power has been in the hands of the military authorities. All the decisions issue from them." End quote. By this statement, he implied that the responsibility for the invasion of Belgium lay with the General Staff and with its chief. The General Staff and the War College for the Training of Officers had clung faithfully to the strategy which had led to the victories of the past, that of bringing up superior forces with all speed to a given point, and in this way breaking the enemy's line of defense, or that of outflanking and surrounding one of his wings, and thus overcoming his resistance by a flank attack. This method of going to work presupposes an offensive. Moltke, like Napoleon, held that merely by taking the offensive one has gone halfway towards winning the battle. These maxims were in harmony with the old Prussian traditions, as well as with the qualities instilled into the Prussian or Prussianized soldier, and finally with the speedy mobilization of the Imperial Army. The decisive victories which in the space of a fortnight had brought the Bulgarians almost to the gates of Constantinople once more bore witness, so the Germans asserted, to the value of this strategy. Had not the King of Greece, it was added, publicly paid a tribute to the instruction received by him at the Berlin Staff College on the day when, like a good pupil at a prize giving, he had been presented with a field marshal's baton by the Emperor in person? The Manchurian campaign, it is true, had warned the world, as was noted at the time by military writers, that a revolution was taking place in the art of war.
I can feel it.
It revealed a new system of strategy and tactics applied by the Russians and Japanese on a front of enormous length.
I do as I
long
please.
Parallel lines of trenches where both sides burrowed themselves in for weeks before there was any possibility of striking a decisive blow. The experts of Berlin, however, would not hear of this war of moles. They were confident even now of making an attack on France with a rapidity that nothing could withstand. They went on dreaming only of whirlwind offensives, of whole armies forced to capitulate, of fresh Sadawas and Sedans. While the German strategy was still looked upon with general admiration, the case was different as regards the tactics, particularly the use of infantry.
The Brahmin? I'll go to the Brahmin. We'll do 20. I don't know where I'm at on the Brahmin. 20. This alone is also Braspati, Lord of the RC. Speech is indeed Brati, and this is its Lord. For this is also Praspati. This alone, the battle force, is question called Angarasi, is also Praspati. How? Speech is indeed Prati, the meter with 36 syllables. The meter and Nustupu is speech. Oh, there they are. Thank you. I think this is what you wanted to point out. I appreciate you.
Infantry, which was much discussed by foreign officers resident in Berlin. One of them, on returning from the great maneuvers of 1913, confessed to me his astonishment at the fighting methods to which the infantry were trained. They still go in for the assault in close formation.
They are assaulting me, yes.
The Sturmangriff, which used to be successful. But nowadays, on a battlefield swept by artillery and machine guns, these close formations would give the other side as good a target as they could wish for. If an attack were led in this way against an enemy who is under cover or is himself determined not to give ground, there would soon be nothing left of it but a heap of dead bodies." End quote. To judge by opinions that I heard on all sides in Berlin, German strategy and tactics have made no advance since 1870. It would seem that in the eyes of the General Staff, they reached their acme at that date. In the equipment and technical preparation of units, on the other hand, Germany can point to a continuous record of progress. Segment 5. During the first years of William II's reign, the work of maintaining Germany's military superiority bore a twofold aspect. To preserve for Germany her place in the front rank of European powers, the place she had won at the price of two great wars, and to ward off attack, to keep all possible foes at bay. The army apparently was not looked upon as an instrument of conquest. It did not seem in any real sense to threaten the empire's neighbors. Although, with its arrogant demeanor, it had an air of openly defying them to make any aggressive move. Has it been the same for the last 10 years or so? A mere study of the most recent military laws will dispel any such notion. The army has been enlarged, equipped, and trained with a view to making war at no distant date. In 1871, it had a peace establishment of 18 corps, or 401,000 men, excluding commissioned and non-commissioned officers. This force remained unchanged until 1880, 5 Army bills passed between 1880 and 1889 aimed at increasing and perfecting its equipment, but the advance in its numbers, slow at the outset, cannot be said to have kept pace with the very rapid growth in the population.
I'm good.
Before 1913,
I will shoot you.
a portion
How about
of
that?
the available contingent had received no military training.
God damn.
Financial motives and the difficulty of raising new taxes prevented the successive war ministers, so the government declared, from calling up as many men as they would
Fucked
like,
up, I promise.
and from enlarging the cadres to a greater extent. These motives suddenly disappeared as soon as William II's warlike designs took definite shape. Acting under the emperor's orders, the chancellor did not hesitate to resort to extraordinary financial measures such as no
Eagle
other
eye.
country has ever
Get off.
adopted in time of peace. In 1905, the 2 years' term of service, which had already been tried experimentally, was made a permanent institution for the infantry, and the establishment rose to 505,000 men. In 1911, the bill for the military quinquennium anticipated only the small increase of 10,000 men even by 1915, but it introduced important technical improvements in machine guns, artillery, supply, and transport, and so forth. In 1912, when the 1911 Act had scarcely begun to take effect, a fresh Army bill was proposed. Public opinion was still in a ferment over the events of the past summer and the aftermath of the Agadir episode. The new act, taking advantage of this wave of patriotism, at once embodied, for working purposes, the measures anticipated by the Bill of 1911. It created 2 new Army Corps, one for the western frontier, the other for the eastern,
The core of the
and
problem,
raised
right?
the peace establishment to 544,000 men. The character of the 1911 and 1912 acts is different from that of the preceding measures. Their primary object was to improve the quality of the Army. They both tended to make it a more effective instrument for fighting, and one more ready for immediate use at the outbreak of hostilities. One might have supposed that after such marked progress, the War Office would have rested on its laurels. It did nothing of the kind. Towards the end of 1912, when the Balkan League was winning its first victories, there set in a current of opinion strongly encouraged by the imperial government in favor of demanding reinforcements to fill up the gaps that still existed. The
I appreciate you.
Wehrverein distinguished itself by its frantic propaganda on behalf of new armaments. A press campaign was organized. The emperor gave his sanction to the movement and in a speech at Königsberg declared that the principle of compulsory service should be applied on a uniform basis. The chancellor, following in his master's footsteps, announced in February at the annual meeting of landed proprietors that the country must be prepared for fresh military burdens. After this official flourish of trumpets, the bill was laid on the table of the Reichstag on March 18, 1913. It fixed the peace establishment, officers and non-commissioned included, at 815,000. The additions were estimated at 4,000 officers, 15,000 NCOs, and 117,000 men. The increase applied to every arm: infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, and supply and transport corps. It was a mighty leap. The measures anticipated by the law of 1912 were to come into force by the end of 1913. Finally, the bill contained a clause trebling the war treasure kept in reserve for the first requirements of a mobilization. It was raised from 150 million to 300 million marks, 15 million pounds, in gold, besides 150 million, 7,500,000 pounds in silver. Was the danger really so pressing? Was the storm already brewing on the frontiers of the empire? If not, it was hard to justify these hasty measures, especially the financial part of the scheme, the forced levy, to cover the enormous expenses, 50 million pounds, which these measures would entail. The explanatory statement, indeed, was far from convincing. It confined itself to remarking that passing events in the Balkans had altered the balance of power in Europe. In the war that she might be compelled to wage, Germany would have only herself to rely upon and would have to guard, perhaps against several opponents, frontiers of great length and largely unprovided with natural defenses. Hence the vital need of employing and organizing all the forces at her disposal. The main ideas of the bill were to introduce a uniform system of military service, with numbers increasing at the same rate as the population, to improve the quality of the first-line troops, in other words, the younger section of the Army, to arrange for a more speedy mobilization, and an object that had always been kept in view, to perfect the technical equipment. In round numbers, an increase of 63,000 men each year was expected. The 1913 Act is full of suggested references to telegraphs, telephones, balloons, aeroplanes, and motor cars, but it volunteers no information regarding the heavy artillery and the siege guns which were destined to startle the world in 1914. This formidable addition to the destructive power of the German army was carefully kept secret. The military authorities had for a long time firmly believed that their army was invincible, and the possession of such irresistible weapons must have served to strengthen their confidence. The Chancellor, in supporting the bill, dwelt more fully on the ideas set forth in the explanatory statement. In vague phrases, he hinted that peace was far from secure, raising up bogeys to frighten his audience. The French Jingos, now more heated than ever, and the Russian Pan-Slavists with their ceaseless intrigues. The War Minister maintained in all seriousness that the new law had no aggressive aim, that it must be construed not as a threat to other nations, but as a guarantee of peace. General von Herringen was asking us to swallow a good deal. As soon as the debate opened at the Budget Committee, it was evident that the bill was certain to pass. A month later, the committee approved it without examining the financial side, and the government had to abandon all hope of seeing both parts of the bill, the military and the financial, passed by the same majority. In the Reichstag, only the Poles, the Socialists, and the Alsace-Lorrainers ventured to vote against the military proposals. The Wehrverein, however, was not satisfied. In a meeting held at Leipzig on May 18, it suggested that 2 new army corps should be formed, and recommended, in order that no enemy should ever again set his foot on the soil of the fatherland, that every care should be taken to foster the martial and patriotic spirit of the community, the spirit of the army being that of the nation. However much we may wish to shut our eyes to the fact, we can hardly fail to see in the 1913 Act a preparation for making war at no distant date. Its call to arms is as clear as the note of a bugle that summons men to the fight. Yet Europe, with her eyes riveted on other visions, the Second Balkan War was imminent, paid far too little attention to the Reichstag debates. Perhaps she was still misled by the spurious pacifism of the Kaiser. The Triple Entente continued to harbor the most peaceful intentions, as is attested by impartial observers who were well informed as to the state of public opinion in the 3 countries and as to the ideals of their statesmen. The desire to provoke a war, therefore, can only be imputed to that government and that nation which were arming to the teeth for battle and for conquest. Segment 6. When one met Grand Admiral von Tirpitz in some official drawing room in Berlin and had a talk with him, one felt oneself in the presence of an interesting personality, what in England is known as a strong man. Among all the advisors of William II, there was no one who gave such an impression of strength and authority. With his fan-shaped beard, his broad forehead and thinning hair above it, his eyes hard and piercing even behind double eyeglasses, his imposing figure that showed a tendency to stoutness, he would have looked like a great manufacturer or financial magnate rather than a sailor, but for the numerous decorations pinned all over his chest. As a matter of fact, he is an office man, an organizer who had never held any high command at sea before he attracted the Emperor's discerning eye and was appointed head of the Admiralty. He was at the time director of the naval station at Kiel, the first military port of the Empire. This station he had entirely transformed, in the teeth of criticism and jobbery, dominating all with his iron will, and making a clean sweep of disorder and red tape. The German fleet owes to him the organization of its torpedo boat section, which has not revealed its prowess during the war, although its creator cannot be blamed for that, and of the quite recently formed flotilla of submarines. Tirpitz has been head of the Admiralty for 18 years, a ministerial length of life that no Chancellor or Secretary of State has yet reached under William II. In order to remain so long in the imperial favor, he has had to show an unusual degree of tact and intelligence. The emperor was intensely eager to possess a most powerful fleet. He had put his own lips to the foghorn. By his speeches and by an incessant personal propaganda, he had made the public interested in the development of the Navy, in the idea of acquiring the mastery of the seas. Our future lies on the water. But the man who had to carry out the sovereign's will was doomed to encounter several obstacles. The first difficulty for an admiralty chief was to put his schemes before the sovereign in such a way that the latter should regard himself as their author. In this respect, Tirpitz displayed more skill than any of his civilian or military colleagues. In the second place, he had to overcome the opposition that the Reichstag,
Play one more.
always
we'll
anxious to save the public money, had hitherto raised against any increase in the naval estimates. With singular adroitness, Admiral von Tirpitz, profiting by various incidents abroad and by the wave of patriotic feeling they produced in the nation, worked upon public opinion and won over many restive or wavering minds in Parliament. Nor was this all. The bills that he introduced would not have emerged safe and sound without any mutilations from the clutches of the Budget Committee, had not their framer been gifted with eloquence, with a power of clear and persuasive speech which found a responsive audience in the middle-class parties. No minister has ever been so successful in winning the ear of the Reichstag, while managing to retain the confidence of the emperor. But why did Germany need so large a navy? Prince von Bülow says in his book, Imperial Germany, quote, "The sea has become a more important factor in our national life than at any previous period. Not excepting the great days of the Hanseatic League, it has become a vital nerve which we must never lose if the young German nation, which is still growing vigorously, is to be kept from suddenly lapsing into a decrepit old age. We should have been exposed to this danger as long as our foreign trade and our mercantile marine had no state protection at sea against the stronger fleets of other nations." End quote. True, but it would seem that this end might have been attained by building a few divisions of cruisers strong enough to protect German shipping and at the same time to threaten the commerce of the enemy. From the earliest days of his reign, as is well known, William II's first thought has been for his fleet. The Navy is his own creation, his favorite child. Nevertheless, the tremendous growth of Germany's naval power coincides, in point of fact, with the entry of Bülow and Tirpitz on the scene, and with the inauguration of that world policy for which the former of these two men, according to his own confession at any rate, must be regarded as primarily responsible. I have already pointed out how elastic is the sense of this term, world policy. For the most peacefully inclined of Germans, it meant a policy of colonial expansion. But the formation of a great navy gave the phrase a more sinister force. It now meant intervention in every part of the globe, acquisitions and settlements in distant regions, without recoiling from bloody encounters such as could not be avoided in European waters. It is from the year 1897, when both Prince von Bülow and Admiral von Tirpitz took up office, that we may date these first ambitious schemes of conquest, which were embodied in the rapid construction of a formidable naval force and reached their inevitable climax in the War of 1914. 15 years were enough for Tirpitz to make the German Navy the second in the world. He advanced by several stages, by successive leaps and bounds. The bill that was brought in on November 27, 1897, demanded that 7 new ships of the line, 2 first-class and 7 second- and third-class cruisers, should be put on the stocks, and fixed the end of the financial year as the date by which these units should be completed, while limiting the period for which ships should be kept on the effective list, and determining the number and strength of the squadrons that were to remain on permanent service. The bill ensured the construction, within a given time limit, of units to replace the vessels that were scrapped. In the autumn of 1899, during the South African War, the seizure of a German mailboat by a British warship and the resentment that this action aroused in Germany were exploited in masterly fashion by Tirpitz in order to introduce a new Navy bill. The patriotic furor of the nation enabled this bill to triumph over all financial obstacles. The explanatory statement called for the creation of a fleet so strong that the greatest naval power of the world might feel uncertain as to the outcome of a struggle with Germany. This was a palpable thrust at Great Britain. In 1906, after Germany had met with such disappointment at the Algeciras Conference, the Reichstag, cleverly manipulated by the Admiral, and with the pressure of national sentiment behind it, passed the supplementary Navy Bill, raising the number of cruisers and providing for the construction of vessels of the dreadnought type. The two first German dreadnoughts, the Nassau and the Westphalen, were laid down in July 1907, launched in 1908, and completed within 3.5 years. Their three successors were built with still greater speed, being
Okay,
finished
let's wait
within
for
2
him to
years.
stop shooting and then I'll
The
shoot.
naval estimates, which in 1898 amounted
The
to
rhythm here, man.
£6,250,000 in 1913, reached the sum of £23,350,000. The honors and decorations showered upon the fortunate admiral after each of his parliamentary triumphs bore striking witness to the gratitude of his sovereign. Prince von Bülow indicates in his book the difficulty of carrying out such a program and at the same time avoiding a rupture with England. The most critical moment came in 1908. It had been shown in the House of Commons, with figures to support the statement, that Germany, by virtue of her last Navy Bill, would by the end of 1916 have 36 vessels of the dreadnought type. This, it was remarked, would compel England to build 44 dreadnoughts within that period. In 1911, Germany would have 13 and England only 12. The German menace to England's naval supremacy excited serious alarm in the island kingdom. The Emperor thought he was making a very skillful move in writing a letter to Lord Tweedmouth, First Lord of the Admiralty, a personal letter, half private, half open in character, in which he insisted on the purely defensive nature of the German program and tried to remove British apprehensions in regard to the development of the Imperial Navy. But the shot missed its mark. By taking part in the discussion, by endeavoring to banish from the minds of English sailors the specter of the German danger, William II, as soon as his unconventional step came to light through its disclosure in the Times, only added fuel to the fire of public feeling and drove the British Parliament to get ships built all the faster in reply to the German challenge. The members of the Asquith cabinet, seeing the approach of the dreadnought era, which would involve an enormous maritime outlay at the very moment when they wished to devote all their available surplus to social reform, made an ineffectual attempt to check this frenzied competition. Their public speeches and their private efforts did not induce Admiral von Tirpitz to deviate for a single instant from the steady course he had marked out for the execution of his program. If for a brief interval in 1913 he seemed to look with favor on the 2 to 3 standard, i.e. 2 German to 3 British dreadnoughts, proposed by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Mr. Winston Churchill, he turned a deaf ear to the suggestion that the two countries should suspend the construction of ships, a naval holiday, for the space of a year. The haughty spirit of the German admiral would make no concessions, and those who pleaded for a limitation of armaments, that vanished dream of the British taxpayer, found that they were dashing themselves against a wall of granite. No one in Germany was louder in his praises of the English sailors. He declared that they were his masters and his models. But like the good German he was, he concealed under the mask of admiration a stubborn resolve to conquer them, to strip them of their insufferable superiority. The fleet that he was mustering was beyond all doubt an offensive weapon, an instrument fashioned with elaborate care for inflicting a deadly wound. Hostilities, however, have broken out sooner than he had foreseen or desired, and before he was ready for the attack. A few years more, and Tirpitz would assuredly have surprised his opponent with a war quite different from anything that the latter expected. A treacherous war of airplanes and submarines, which would have made up for his inferiority in numbers. The blockade of England, which he has tried to carry out today with inadequate means, enables us to gauge his audacity, as well as his utter lack of humanitarian scruples. What would have been the result of such a struggle under the sea if the German effort had been backed by a patient and methodical preparation? Still, even if England had been vanquished, Germany would have been drawn into other naval wars. In the process of establishing her world power, she would have had to force other rivals to lower their flag. It would have been essential for her to destroy the United States Navy in order to confine the Americans to the northern half of their continent and to keep the markets of South America open exclusively to her own trade. After this, would she have been content to leave to the Japanese the mastery of the Pacific and to be thwarted or driven out by them in the Far East? What a vista of conflicts for the organizer of the German Navy. What a task for his own tireless energies and for those of his successors. Such are the inevitable results of the first step on the endless track of Weltpolitik. Admiral von Tirpitz has been helped in his labors by a host of nameless fellow workers grouped together under the title of German Navy League, Deutscher Flottenverein. This society of 1,250,000 members, with branches all over Germany, forms a loyal and well-trained army, acting under the orders of Admiral von Kester, a former commander-in-chief of the fleet. By its manifold propaganda, its public meetings, its periodicals, its pamphlets, its cinematograph films, its arrangements for pleasure trips to naval ports, the League has spread among the people, in great towns and tiny villages alike, from the sandy plains of Brandenburg to the picturesque valleys of the Harz Mountains, a knowledge and appreciation of the work that William II and Admiral von Tirpitz have achieved. During the darkest hours of the Moroccan crisis, the League's overflowing patriotism expressed itself in scurrilous pamphlets and shameless lies, scattered broadcast at the expense of England and France. It is therefore among the elements that have served to kindle a wrath and foment a hatred for which war alone could provide an outlet. End of section 6.
Flag returned.
Section 7 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Bayans, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Leinhardt. Chapter 4, The Reichstag and Political Parties. Segment 1. It is difficult for a foreigner to form any proper notion of the political groups represented in the Reichstag if he yields to the temptation of looking for parallels with the party system of his own country, and if he confuses the political institutions of Germany with those of a nation possessing a parliamentary government. In the first place, perhaps, it will be desirable briefly to sketch the mechanism of the 1871 Constitution, which, apart from slight changes needed for the imperial framework, is merely a replica of the Constitution drawn up by Bismarck for the North German Confederation. The empire is a federal and constitutional state, with a sovereign who not merely reigns but governs, his status being a modern evolution from the old absolute monarchy of Prussia. The emperor is the warlord. He commands the army and regulates its organization. He has the supreme direction of foreign affairs, both diplomatic and commercial, and at home appoints the imperial functionaries. He sanctions the bills approved by the Bundesrat, or Federal Council, and passed by the Reichstag. He dispenses the executive power and imposes his sovereign will through the medium of a chancellor. This ministerial figure represents the emperor in the Reichstag and assumes the responsibility for the acts of the government. This nominal responsibility is entirely unlike that of a minister in a parliamentary country, for it does not bind him at all in relation to Parliament, but only in relation to his master, and also, in a certain measure, whatever some may allege, to public opinion. The Chancellor, however, holds a plurality of dignities and functions. He is jack of all trades to the monarchy, president of the Prussian ministry, president of the Bundesrat, and imperial minister for foreign affairs. These complex duties might well prove too exacting for a genuine statesman, how much more so for a mere politician. Owing to the difference of spirit between the Prussian Chamber of Deputies and the Reichstag, He has to appear before the former in the stern guise of a rigid conservative, while in the latter his face wears a more attractive mask, being set off with a tinge of liberalism. The Chancellor is thus compelled, by the very nature of his functions, to be an opportunist in internal politics. The Bundesrat, composed of representatives sent to it by the individual states, is a pliable tool in the hands of the Emperor and the other German rulers, who themselves obey the imperial will. It shares the legislative power with the head of the empire and with the Reichstag. Bismarck held that the best way of uprooting the particularism of the small states and clearing the ground for final unification was to invite all citizens of 25 years and upwards to elect representatives for the central parliament. The Reichstag, chosen by universal suffrage, is the popular assembly, the real mouthpiece of public opinion. Its powers are limited to voting upon the budget and upon laws for the empire, which must be taken as meaning laws of national interest. This democratic parliament, however, controls, so far as it can, the administration of public affairs. Its best weapon of defense against the arbitrary power of the crown is the opposition it can raise to any government proposals for expenditure or taxation. It has often used this weapon, but if it presses its opposition too far, it runs the risk of being dissolved by a mere decree of the emperors to make room for an assembly that will prove more open to compromise. By the side of the empire are the federal states and the 3 free cities, which possess local executives and diets. In order to furnish these states with the means of separate existence, Bismarck, while instituting a special budget for the empire, left to them the revenue obtained from direct taxes. The imperial budget draws its nutriment from the customs, the excise, and the postal service. The amount derived from these sources being insufficient, it also receives the matricular contributions, matricular by Triga, paid by each state on a scale that keeps the balance of the budget properly adjusted. Segment 2. Prince von Bülow, in his Imperial Germany, asserts that the German race, although richly endowed with great qualities, has no talent for politics. This charge is quite unfair, the real motive for it being the dread with which a Prussian statesman views the prospect of a parliamentary system. The Germans are latecomers in the field of political life. Those of the South entered it much earlier than the Prussians.
Hold on, I'll be right back. I didn't know that. Oh yeah, you can feel the gravity walking through the house. They have it at checkpoints to make it seem like it's like sample space, but like gravity. Oh yeah, definitely. That's how they're fooling the general public with what they're saying, with the mask going on there.
Bavaria received
They're laying lines of gravity through homes, like the toilet,
a written constitution from its ruler in 1818.
And then basically the weight
Baden in the same
rotates
year,
around that spot.
Württemberg in
Affects it
1819,
accordingly.
and Hesse-Darmstadt in 1820. It was not till 1850 that Frederick William IV, impelled by the sanguinary riots in Berlin 2 years earlier, granted his people the constitution promised by his father a few weeks before Waterloo. Even today, popular representation as it exists among the Germans is in many ways incomplete. In this respect, they are a backward people. They, who pride
They're warring on
themselves
the
on
satellite
marching
there.
in the
Get it
forefront
off
of
my
civilization,
with a cell tower,
they look
whatever it
from
may be.
afar at the little nations, which they despise,
Whatever it may be.
boldly advancing on the
Sign the
road
warrant
of
on that.
parliamentarism, of progress in the sphere of political institutions, the road that England, as pioneer, has opened up for other countries.
I think
Yet
they
there
might
is
be
nothing to
confused.
prove that, if they were given the chance, they would not shake off their political torpor and set out upon that road with admirable results. Under the present Constitution, the political parties in the Reichstag have no hope of ever securing the reins of power. The Chancellor and his underlings, the Secretaries of State, are functionaries who cannot be removed so long as it pleases the Emperor to keep them in office. When the popular assembly formally records its lack of confidence in them, the vote is like a harmless shower of rain from which they can shelter themselves under the cloak of the Constitution. If these hostile downpours came very often, indeed, the Emperor would have to take notice of them and to effect a change in the high executive staff, but he would not on that account draw his ministers from the parliamentary majority. The party chiefs, never having the responsibility of power, are far less keen for the interests of the state than for those of their party. In a theoretical doctrinaire fashion, they defend the political program comprising all the demands which they and their predecessors have artistically put together, a nosegay with whose delusive fragrance they charm their electors from time to time. But they know perfectly well that this ideal program can never be carried out. Some, as skilled tacticians and leaders of men, like Windhorse and Babel, have displayed talents of the first
Okay.
order. Why should it be impossible to find, among the various party leaders, the stuff of which good parliamentary ministers are made? We have never seen them put to the test, but we can very well imagine Herr Bosserman at the head of a liberal ministry, or Herr Spahn in a coalition conservative cabinet, a blue and black cabinet such as has been tried in Holland.
Stahl's
Note,
machine.
in continental politics,
You guys are going
blue
to
is the
jail.
color
I
of the
hate to be that
conservatives
guy.
proper, black that of the clericals.
They are going to jail for the rest of their life, or what's going to happen here. Not arguing about it at all. See you, dude. Yeah, I'm kind of getting tired of it. I don't know how long I've been doing this. Keep interrupting you. I think it's kind of funny. They're not, but I mean, it is. Oh, Napoleon. About halfway through it. No, they are not. I promise. Go ahead, and you are excused. I will be moving forward with everything that's being said here. Thank you. Roadblock, come on. Epona, roadblock. I'm not kidding. The hurdles, come on. In fact, again, I pardoned, as was mentioned. The Alamo is the one who's doing it. Uh, 2.5 hours? I'll stop at that. I didn't realize. Try to keep it at an hour.